There is something wrong with the story you were told about stone circles. Not wrong in the way that textbooks sometimes get small details wrong, or wrong in the way that historians occasionally misdate a battle or misname a king. Wrong in a deeper, more unsettling way. Wrong in the way that happens when an entire civilization leaves behind the most extraordinary structures in the history of the ancient world, and nobody writing the explanations ever actually stopped to ask what the people who built them were trying to do. You have been told, probably since the first time you saw a photograph of Stonehenge in a school book, that stone circles were places of worship, ritual sites, sacred spaces where prehistoric priests gathered to perform ceremonies, to honor the dead, to commune with the sun on a midsummer morning. That is the story. That is the version that gets printed in the tourist brochures, repeated on the guided tours, stated with tremendous confidence by people who have studied these structures for decades. And it is almost certainly not the whole truth. Britain has more stone circles than anywhere else on Earth, more than 1,000 of them scattered across the landscape from the far northern tip of Scotland, down through Ireland and Wales and into the west of England. Some of them are tiny, barely noticeable rings of stones, no taller than your knee. Some of them are enormous, complex, staggeringly ambitious engineering projects that required the coordination of thousands of people over generations. They were built over a span of roughly 3,000 years, from around 3000 BCE to somewhere around 1000 BCE. That is a period longer than the entire history of Christianity, longer than the gap between the fall of Rome and right now. And in all that time, across all that geography, through all those centuries of construction and refinement and modification, the people who built these structures left no written records, not a single inscription, not a carved explanation, not a symbol that any modern linguist has ever been able to definitively decode into language. What they left was the stones themselves. And if you look at the stones carefully, and if you look at where they are placed, and if you look at what they are pointing at, and if you look at the patterns underneath the ground that archaeologists have only recently begun to uncover, a completely different picture starts to emerge. A picture that is stranger than worship, more practical than ritual, more ambitious than anything the standard story has ever given these people credit for. If you are watching this to fall asleep, that is exactly why I make these videos. Maybe subscribe and let me know where you are right now and what time it is. I always check the comments, and it genuinely fascinates me. Someone in the Scottish Highlands right now, maybe, listening to this in the dark, somewhere near a landscape that still carries the weight of what those ancient builders left behind. Someone in Tokyo, someone in California, someone in New Zealand, where it is already tomorrow. All of you, drifting towards sleep, with the same ancient mystery, humming somewhere underneath the words. So let us begin at the beginning, and the beginning is not Stonehenge. Most people think of Stonehenge when they think of stone circles, and that is understandable. Stonehenge is the most famous prehistoric monument in the world. It has been photographed more times than almost any other structure on Earth. It sits on Salisbury Plain in Wiltshire, in the south of England, and it is undeniably extraordinary. The massive sarsen stones, some of them weighing more than 25 tons, arranged with a precision that still makes modern engineers shake their heads slightly in disbelief. But Stonehenge is not where the story starts. And Stonehenge is not, despite its fame, even the most interesting stone circle in Britain. It is the most visible. It is the most photographed. It is the one that makes it onto the magazine covers and into the Hollywood films. But if you want to understand what stone circles actually were, and what the people who built them were actually trying to accomplish, Stonehenge is almost the wrong place to begin. The story starts somewhere much older, somewhere much simpler, somewhere that most people have never heard of. It starts in Scotland. In 2004, a team of archaeologists working in Aberdeenshire, in the northeast of Scotland, began excavating a site near the town of Craithes. They were not looking for anything spectacular. This was a routine survey, the kind of methodical ground truthing that archaeologists do before construction projects, checking to see whether anything of historical significance is buried beneath a field or a car park or a planned housing development. What they found instead was a row of pits. 12 pits, arranged in a slightly irregular arc, carved into the ground roughly 10,000 years ago. 10,000 years. That puts them 4,000 years before Stonehenge. 7,000 years before the pyramids of Giza. These pits were not random. They were not the accidental result of tree roots or animal burrows. They were deliberately dug, and they were dug in a specific pattern that corresponded, with extraordinary accuracy, to the movements of the moon as seen from that precise location on the Earth. The archaeologist who eventually analyzed the alignment, Vicky Cummings, described it as the world's oldest calendar, a device for tracking time, for keeping count of the lunar months, for knowing, with certainty, when the seasons were about to change. This is not worship. This is not ritual. This is information management. This is technology. And that distinction matters enormously. Because once you start looking at ancient monuments through the lens of technology rather than religion, everything about them changes. The questions you ask change. The answers you find change. The story changes completely. Britain is a strange place to build a civilization. It is a collection of islands perched at the northwestern edge of Europe, battered by Atlantic weather systems that come rolling in off the ocean with very little warning and a great deal of violence. The climate in the period when stone circles were being built, the Neolithic and early Bronze Age, was slightly warmer than it is today, but it was still fundamentally unpredictable. Winters could be brutal. Summers could be short, rainfall was erratic, rivers flooded without warning. For the farming communities that were beginning to establish themselves across Britain during this period, the difference between surviving a winter and not surviving a winter often came down to timing. Plant your crops too early and a late frost destroys them. Plant too late, and they do not have time to mature before the autumn rains arrive. Slaughter your livestock at the wrong time of year, and you lose animals you needed for breeding. Miss the salmon run by a few days, and you lose a critical source of protein. These are not abstract problems. These are life and death problems. And solving them requires one thing above almost everything else. You need to know what time of year it is. Not what day of the month it is, in the way that we think of dates. Not Wednesday the 14th, but something much more fundamental. You need to know where you are in the cycle of the year. How many days until the solstice? How many weeks until the spring thaw arrives? How much time is left before the first frost? And to know that, in a world with no clocks, no calendars, no written records, no accumulated database of meteorological observations, you need to watch the sky. The sky is the only clock that works perfectly, consistently, year after year, century after century. The sun rises in a slightly different place on the horizon each morning. Over the course of a year, it traces a path from its most northerly rise, at the summer solstice, to its most southerly rise, at the winter solstice, and back again. If you know exactly where the sun rises on a given morning, you know exactly where you are in that annual cycle. Not approximately, exactly. The moon does something similar, but more complex. The moon's cycle has two rhythms layered on top of each other. The monthly cycle, from new moon to full moon and back again, takes roughly 29.5 days. But the moon also has a longer cycle, called the Metonic cycle, or the lunar standstill cycle, in which the points on the horizon where the moon rises and sets shift gradually over a period of approximately 18.5 years, reaching a maximum northerly and southerly position, the major lunar standstill, before retreating back towards center and then swinging out again. This 18.5-year cycle is extraordinarily useful for a farming community. If you know where you are in that cycle, you can predict the tides, you can predict the flooding of rivers, you can correlate your planting and harvesting schedules with lunar rhythms that have proven reliable over generations. You can build up a body of practical knowledge that gets more accurate with every cycle that passes. But to track these cycles, you need to be able to see the sky. And you need to be able to mark specific positions on the horizon so that you can compare what you see today with what your parents saw and what their parents saw before them. You need, in other words, something permanent on the landscape, something that will still be standing in 20 years when the lunar standstill comes around again, something that will still be standing in 100 years when you want to compare this year's observations with the records built up over 5 generations. Something that will not rot, will not collapse, will not wash away in a flood or burn down in a fire. You need stone. This is the origin of stone circles, not worship, not religion, not sacrifice. The origin of stone circles is the same impulse that drives every civilization that has ever looked at an uncertain world and tried to bring some order to it. The origin of stone circles is the desire to know, the need to understand, the ancient, irreducible human drive to look at a complicated and dangerous world and say, I can figure this out. Now, the moment that idea settles into your mind, something extraordinary happens. You start to look at the distribution of stone circles across Britain differently. You stop seeing them as scattered holy sites, randomly placed across the landscape according to some inscrutable spiritual logic. You start to see them as a network, because that is what they are. Look at a map of Britain with all the known stone circles plotted on it. There are more than 1,000 of them, as we said, but they are not randomly distributed. They cluster in particular regions. They concentrate along river valleys and coastal plains and the edges of high moorland, which are precisely the areas where Neolithic farming communities would have been most active. They appear at intervals that suggest deliberate spacing, as though someone was making decisions about coverage, about sight lines, about the network of information that needed to be maintained across a territory. Several researchers have noted something else about the distribution. Many stone circles are visible from other stone circles. Not all of them, and the sight lines are sometimes distant and subtle, but the pattern appears too frequently to be accidental. It is as though the builders understood that a single observatory is limited. A single observation point can only watch a single patch of sky. But a network of observatories, each one communicating with the others through signal fires or runners or some other mechanism we have not yet identified, can monitor an entire landscape simultaneously. This is not primitive thinking. This is systems thinking. This is the kind of infrastructure planning that we associate with advanced civilizations, with empires and city-states and sophisticated bureaucracies. And it was happening in Britain 4,000 or 5,000 years ago. Let us talk about what it actually takes to build a stone circle, because I think this is where the standard story most seriously underestimates the people who built them. Stonehenge, the famous one, the one on the magazine covers, is actually a relatively late development in the long sequence of prehistoric construction on Salisbury Plain. The site was in use for a very long time before the famous Sarsen stone circle was erected. But the Sarsen stones, those massive upright stones with the horizontal lintels balanced on top of them, were put in place somewhere around 2500 BCE. The largest of these stones came from a quarry roughly 25 kilometers north of Stonehenge. The blue stones, a smaller inner circle made from a different type of rock, came from the Preseli Hills in Wales, roughly 250 kilometers away. 250 kilometers in 2500 BCE, without wheeled vehicles, without horses, without iron tools, without cranes. The accepted explanation for how they were moved involves sledges and rollers and ropes and sheer brute manpower. Experimental archaeologists have reproduced portions of this process using period-appropriate technology, and it works, but it is extremely labor-intensive. Moving even a single stone of the size used at Stonehenge required the coordinated effort of hundreds of people working for days. Moving the entire collection of blue stones from Wales to Wiltshire represents an organizational achievement that is frankly staggering. Why would a community expend that kind of resource, that kind of coordinated collective energy, on a purely religious site? The answer that is usually offered is that religion motivated extraordinary efforts in ancient cultures, just as it did later with the construction of the great cathedrals and the Egyptian pyramids. And that is not wrong. Religion has motivated extraordinary collective effort throughout human history. But here is the thing. Cathedrals and pyramids were also practical. They were centers of economic power. They were political statements. They were demonstrations of state capacity. They were organizational headquarters for complex bureaucratic and administrative systems. The religious function was genuine and important, but it was not the only function. There is no reason to believe that stone circles were any different, and there is growing evidence that they were, in fact, much more. Alexander Thom was a Scottish engineer who spent much of the 20th century doing something that was considered slightly eccentric by the archaeological establishment of his day. He measured things. He measured stone circles, hundreds of them, with the kind of precision that an engineer brings to his work, rather than the kind of broad impressionism that was more common in archaeology at the time. He measured angles and alignments and distances and heights. He surveyed, he calculated, he compared. And what he found, when he published his results in a series of papers and books beginning in the 1960s, shook the archaeological world. Tom found that stone circles across Britain were built using a consistent unit of measurement. He called it the megalithic yard, approximately 0.829 meters. This unit appears in the dimensions of stone circles from Scotland to Cornwall, from Wales to the east of England. Structures built centuries apart, in regions with very little obvious cultural contact, were using the same fundamental measurement. Think about what that means. A unit of measurement is not a natural phenomenon. It does not emerge from the landscape. It does not spontaneously arise in isolated communities. A unit of measurement is a social agreement. It is a technology that has to be invented, taught, maintained, and transmitted from one person to another, from one community to another, from one generation to the next. The existence of a consistent unit of measurement across the entire landscape of Britain, used over a period of centuries, implies the existence of a communication and teaching network of considerable sophistication. It implies, in other words, a profession, a guild, a group of specialist knowledge keepers who traveled between communities, carrying with them the knowledge of how to build these structures, how to orient them correctly, how to lay out their dimensions with precision. Who were these people? We do not know their names. We do not know what they called themselves, but the evidence of their work is everywhere, and the precision of that work tells us something important about how sophisticated their knowledge was. Tom also analyzed the astronomical alignments of the circles he surveyed, and his findings here were even more controversial. He found that many stone circles were aligned not just to the solstices, the rising and setting of the sun at midsummer and midwinter, which even the most skeptical archaeologists have generally accepted as genuine. He found alignments to the equinoxes, to the rising and setting positions of specific bright stars, to the extreme rising and setting positions of the moon during the major lunar standstill. He found, in fact, that some stone circles appear to be capable of predicting lunar eclipses. This claim was met with considerable skepticism when Tom first published it. It sounded too sophisticated. It implied a level of astronomical knowledge that the standard narrative of prehistoric Britain simply could not accommodate. The prevailing view of Neolithic people was that they were primitive, that they lacked the intellectual tools to make such refined observations, that whatever astronomical knowledge they had must have been crude and approximate. But Tom was an engineer, and engineers are not easily swayed by narrative convenience. He had the numbers, and the numbers said what they said. In the decades since Tom's work, subsequent researchers using more sophisticated analytical tools and larger datasets have largely validated his central findings, while debating some of the more extreme specific claims. The astronomical alignments are real, the consistent unit of measurement is real, the precision of construction is real. And gradually, reluctantly, the field of archaeoastronomy, which studies the astronomical knowledge of ancient cultures, has had to reckon with the fact that the builders of Britain's stone circles knew an enormous amount about the sky. Let us stay in Scotland for a moment, because Scotland has some of the most interesting stone circles in Britain, and they are among the least talked about. The Callanish standing stones are on the Isle of Lewis, in the Outer Hebrides, off the northwest coast of Scotland. They were erected sometime around 2900 BCE, making them roughly contemporary with the later phases of Stonehenge construction, but possibly older in some of their elements. The Callanish complex is not a simple circle. It is an elaborate arrangement of standing stones forming a cross-shaped pattern with a central stone circle at the intersection and long avenues of stones radiating outward. From the central stone circle at Callanish, looking south across a body of water called Loch Roag, the southern horizon is defined by a range of hills. These hills have a distinctive profile, a long, flat ridge that rises gently at one end, creating a shape that several researchers have compared to the silhouette of a reclining human figure, which has given it the local name of the Sleeping Beauty, or, in Gaelic, Cailleach na Mointiach, the Old Woman of the Moors. And here is the thing about those hills. Once every 18.5 years, at the time of the major lunar standstill, the full moon at its most southerly extreme appears to skim along the ridge of those hills and then set directly into the central avenue of the Callanish stones. The moon appears to walk along the body of the old woman of the moors, and then descend into the earth at the exact point marked by the stones. This is not coincidence. The probability of this alignment occurring by accident, given all the other orientations the builders could have chosen, is vanishingly small. The Callanish stones were placed here, on this particular island, facing this particular direction, precisely because of this alignment. The builders knew about the major lunar standstill. They knew its period. They knew where on the horizon the moon would reach its extreme southern position, and they built their monument to mark that position with absolute precision. But why? What was the practical value of marking the major lunar standstill? The answer takes us into territory that is less well understood but genuinely fascinating. The major lunar standstill is not just an astronomical curiosity, it has real effects on the physical world. During the years around the major lunar standstill, tidal patterns change. The difference between high tides and low tides becomes more extreme. River flooding becomes more likely. Certain fish migration patterns are affected. For a coastal farming and fishing community like the one that existed on the Isle of Lewis 4,000 years ago, tracking the lunar standstill cycle would have had immediate practical consequences. If you knew that the major lunar standstill was approaching, you could prepare. You could position your nets differently. You could reinforce riverbank structures before the flooding season. You could make decisions about where to plant crops based on predicted flooding patterns. You could, in other words, turn astronomical knowledge into agricultural and fishing advantage. The major lunar standstill does not happen every year, or even every decade. It happens every 18.5 years. A human lifetime might contain 3 or 4 of them. Without a permanent record, without a structure in the landscape that marks the position of the moon at its extreme, without a monument that says this is where it goes at the maximum of the cycle, the knowledge of the cycle's timing would be extremely difficult to maintain across generations. The Callanish stones are that record. They are the external memory that preserves the knowledge of the cycle, even when the living memory of the last occurrence has faded. This is what writing does. When a culture has writing, it externalizes memory. It moves knowledge out of individual human minds, where it is vulnerable to being lost through death or forgetting, and into a physical medium where it can persist and be consulted again and again. The builders of Callanish did not have writing. They had stone, and they used it to do exactly what writing does. Move south from Scotland and you find a different kind of monument with a different kind of story. The Rollright stones are in Oxfordshire, near the border with Warwickshire, in the middle of England. They are not as dramatic as Stonehenge or Callanish. The stones are relatively small, most of them no more than a metre or so tall, arranged in a rough circle about 30 metres in diameter. They have been somewhat battered by centuries of weather and agricultural activity, and they do not have the imposing grandeur of the great megalithic sites in the west of Britain. But the Rollright stones have something that almost no other stone circle has. They have a written legend that was already old when it was first recorded. And that legend, stripped of the later folklore accretions that inevitably attach themselves to any ancient monument, contains something interesting. The legend says that the stones were once men, soldiers of a conquering king, who were turned to stone by a witch. The king was told that if he could see the village of Long Compton from a particular hilltop, he would become King of England. He took 7 strides toward the hilltop, but a long earth ridge obscured his view of the village, and at that moment the witch turned him and his men to stone. Now, that is a story. It is a piece of medieval folklore attached to a prehistoric monument, and it contains all the expected elements of medieval folklore: a king, a witch, a magical transformation, a test. It tells us nothing factual about the people who actually built the Rollright stones 3,000 or 4,000 years before the medieval period. But there is one detail in the legend that keeps nagging at researchers: the 7 strides. In the legend, the king takes exactly 7 strides before he is transformed. Why 7? Why not 5, or 3, or 10? Because 7 is the number of visible planets in the ancient astronomical tradition. 7 is the number of heavenly bodies that move independently against the fixed background of stars, as seen with the naked eye. Sun, Moon, Mercury, Venus, Mars, Jupiter, Saturn, 7. The number 7 has been associated with astronomical knowledge in virtually every ancient culture that has left records. Is this a coincidence? Almost certainly, at one level. The legend of the Seven Strides is almost certainly a piece of medieval storytelling that borrowed the number 7 for its own narrative purposes. But the fact that medieval storytellers reached for the number 7 when constructing a legend about a prehistoric monument is itself suggestive. It hints at a residual cultural memory of the astronomical function of these sites, a memory so faded by the medieval period that it had transformed into folklore, but not yet entirely erased. Let us go further back in time. Let us go to the oldest large-scale construction project in Britain's prehistory, the monument that preceded Stonehenge on Salisbury Plain by more than 1,000 years. Before Stonehenge, there was a wooden monument at almost the same location. Archaeologists call it the Stonehenge Mesolithic posts, though that name understates what they were. These were massive post holes, carved into the ground approximately 10,000 years ago, at roughly the same time as those pits in Aberdeenshire that we discussed earlier. 3 large posts, probably pine trees of considerable diameter, arranged in a roughly east-west alignment, and that alignment corresponds to the rising and setting of the sun at the equinoxes, not the solstices. Not the famous midsummer sunrise that most people associate with Stonehenge, but the equinoxes, the 2 days in the year when day and night are of equal length. Why the equinoxes? Because the equinoxes are the pivot points of the agricultural year. They are the moments when the balance tips from one season to another, from the cold half of the year to the warm half, and back again. For a farming community, the equinoxes are arguably more important than the solstices. The solstices tell you when summer and winter have reached their peak. The equinoxes tell you when spring and autumn have arrived. The fact that the first major construction project on Salisbury Plain, 10,000 years ago, was oriented to the equinoxes rather than the solstices tells us something important. The later reorientation of Stonehenge itself toward the midsummer solstice sunrise was a deliberate choice, made by people who understood what the earlier alignment had been and decided to change it. They were not following an ancient tradition blindly. They were making astronomical decisions. They were choosing what to measure and how to measure it. That is not religion, that is science. Let us follow the thread of evidence westward, into Wales, where the story of stone circles takes a turn that even the most hardened skeptic of ancient sophistication might find difficult to explain away. The blue stones of Stonehenge, as we mentioned, came from the Preseli Hills in Pembrokeshire, in West Wales. Archaeologists have identified the specific quarry sites, 2 of them, called Carn Goedog and Rosephelin, from which the blue stones were extracted roughly 5,000 years ago. The methods of extraction have been studied and are now relatively well understood. The builders exploited natural fracture lines in the rock, carefully inserting wooden wedges and levers to detach slabs of the desired size. But here is what is less well understood and less talked about. The quarry sites at Carn Goedog and Rosephelin were not chosen randomly. They were chosen because the rock, at those specific locations, has particular acoustic properties. Acoustic properties. The sound properties of stone. Archaeoacoustics is a relatively young field, barely more than a couple of decades old, as a serious area of academic study. But it has already produced some results that demand attention. Several researchers, most notably Rupert Till and Bruno Fazenda, at the University of Huddersfield, have done detailed acoustic modelling of Stonehenge in its various phases, and what they found is that the completed sarsen stone monument would have had remarkable acoustic properties. Sound produced within the circle, voice, drumming, music, would have been reflected and amplified by the stone lintels in ways that created distinctive and dramatic auditory effects. Standing in the centre of Stonehenge and speaking, you would hear your voice return to you from multiple directions simultaneously, creating an effect of extraordinary presence and resonance. This could, of course, be accidental. The acoustic properties might simply be a byproduct of the structural design that was chosen for other reasons. But then there is the bluestone. The specific type of dolerite from which the Stonehenge bluestones are made has an unusual property. When struck, it rings. It produces a clear, bell-like tone that carries well and is distinctly musical. This property is not shared by all types of dolerite. The specific geological composition of the rock from Carn Goedog and Rosephelin gives it this characteristic, and this characteristic is not common in the broader Preseli Hills area. The builders of Stonehenge travelled 250 kilometres specifically to quarry rock from these two sites, among all the possible sources of stone they could have used. The standard explanation is that these sites were already considered sacred, perhaps because they were the source of an earlier monument, a blue stone circle erected in Wales and then dismantled and moved to Salisbury Plain. But an alternative explanation is simpler and, in some ways, more interesting. They chose that rock because it rings, because when you strike it, it sings. Because a circle of stones that produces extraordinary sound when percussion instruments are played within it is not just an astronomical observatory, it is also a concert hall, a sonic environment that has been deliberately engineered for a specific auditory experience. And that raises a question that the standard archaeological narrative has never fully answered. Why would a farming community expend the colossal effort of moving 250 kilometers of stone specifically for its sound properties, unless sound itself was one of the primary functions of the monument? The answer might be more practical than it first appears. Think about what you can do with exceptional acoustics. You can give instructions to a large crowd of people assembled within or around the circle and have your voice carry to all of them simultaneously. You can make announcements. You can teach. You can disseminate information across a gathering of hundreds of people in a way that is simply not possible in an open field without amplification. Stone circles as teaching environments, as places where the astronomical knowledge encoded in their alignments could be transmitted orally, with the help of the acoustic architecture, to large numbers of people at once. The recurring gatherings at stone circles, which are documented in the archaeological record as involving fires, feasting, large numbers of people travelling long distances, these were not just religious assemblies, they were knowledge-sharing events. They were the annual or periodic occasions when communities from across a wide region came together to pool their observations, compare their records, teach the next generation, and maintain the network of shared knowledge that made coordinated agriculture across a landscape possible. The stone circle was the university. The solstice gathering was the academic conference. It is a radically different picture from the one you were given in school, and it is supported, quietly and persistently, by the evidence. Let me take you to a site that very few people outside Scotland have heard of, but that may be the single most important stone circle in Britain for understanding what these monuments actually were. The Ring of Brodgar is on the Orkney Islands, a cluster of islands off the far northern tip of Scotland. Orkney is about as far north as you can go in Britain before you reach the open ocean. It is windswept and treeless and, in winter, brutally cold. The sea around it is dangerous. Getting to Orkney from mainland Britain in the Neolithic period required sophisticated boat building and seamanship. It was not an easy journey. And yet, despite being in one of the most remote and difficult environments in the British Isles, Orkney is home to the most extraordinary concentration of Neolithic monuments anywhere in Britain: the Ring of Brodgar, the stones of Stenness, the Ness of Brodgar, the tombs of Maeshowe and Unstan, all within a few kilometres of each other, all constructed roughly 5,000 years ago, during a period that archaeologists now call the Neolithic flowering of Orkney. The Ring of Brodgar is a massive stone circle, originally 60 stones arranged in a perfect circle, roughly 104 metres in diameter. The ditch surrounding it was quarried from solid rock using stone tools to a depth of nearly 3 metres and a width of roughly 10 metres. The amount of labour involved in quarrying that ditch alone is estimated at roughly 80,000 man-hours. 80,000 man-hours. That is, to put it in some perspective, roughly 40 people working full-time for a year. And this is not a large, wealthy civilization. This is a community of farmers and fishers on a remote island at the northern edge of the habitable world. Why? Why spend that kind of collective resource on a monument in this location, on these islands? The standard answer involves Orkney's status as a spiritual centre, a sacred island, a place of special religious significance to the wider Neolithic world. And there may be something to that. The concentration of monuments on Orkney is extraordinary enough that it does suggest the islands had some kind of special significance to the wider population. But there is another possible answer, one that is suggested by Orkney's geography rather than its spirituality. Orkney sits at the intersection of two major sea routes, the route along the eastern coast of Britain from the continental landmass northward, and the route along the western coast through the Irish Sea and around the northern tip of Scotland. For maritime communities, for traders and travellers in boats, Orkney was a natural waypoint, a place where two major routes crossed, where ships from different directions might meet and exchange information. And here is something that the Ring of Brodgar shares with many other stone circles in coastal and island locations: its visibility from the sea. From boats approaching Orkney from multiple directions, the Ring of Brodgar, particularly its stones silhouetted against the sky at dawn or dusk, would have been visible from a significant distance. It would have functioned as a landmark, a navigation marker, a fixed point in a landscape of ocean and island that helped sailors know where they were. Lighthouses are an obvious analogy, but the comparison understates it. A lighthouse tells you where you are. A stone circle aligned to the rising of the midsummer sun tells you where you are and what time of year it is. If you are a sailor approaching an unfamiliar coast in an unfamiliar season, that is exactly the information you need. Navigation in the Neolithic period was more sophisticated than most people assume. These communities were not confined to their immediate territories. The archaeological evidence, in the form of traded goods found at sites far from their places of origin, shows that long-distance maritime trade was happening regularly. Flint, from specific sources in the south of England, was travelling to Scotland. Preseli bluestone, from Wales, was travelling to Wiltshire. Pottery styles from Ireland were appearing in Scotland. Decorative objects made from materials available only in one region were turning up in archaeological contexts hundreds of kilometers away. This trade required navigation. It required knowing how to get from one place to another across open water. It required astronomical knowledge, the ability to use the sun and stars for direction finding, and it required a shared set of reference points in the landscape, agreed upon landmarks that all the traders knew, and that meant the same thing to all of them. The network of stone circles along Britain's coastlines and on its islands may have been precisely that: a shared navigational infrastructure, maintained by the communities that used it, oriented to astronomical phenomena that provided reliable directional and temporal information, visible from the water at significant distances. This is not a fringe theory. It is an extension of well-documented principles of maritime navigation into the Neolithic context. And it makes the distribution of stone circles, so puzzling when viewed purely through the lens of religious geography, considerably more intelligible. But there is another layer to this story, one that connects the stone circles not just to astronomy and navigation, but to something that is, in many ways, even more fundamental to the survival of early agricultural communities: water. Not the management of water, in the sense of irrigation or drainage, though those things were certainly important, but the prediction of water, the ability to know, in advance, when rains would come, when rivers would flood, when droughts would begin and end. In Britain, the connection between stone circle sites and water is striking. An extraordinary number of stone circles are located near rivers, near lakes, near the coast, near springs and marshy ground. For a long time, this was interpreted as a religious connection, the ancient veneration of water as a sacred element, which is certainly documented across many ancient cultures and has left traces in the folklore of Britain well into the modern period. But water and astronomy are not separate subjects. They are deeply, practically connected. River flooding in Britain, particularly in the upland areas where stone circles are concentrated, is not random. It follows patterns. It correlates with rainfall cycles that are themselves influenced by large-scale atmospheric patterns. And those atmospheric patterns have astronomical dimensions. The position of the moon, the angle of the sun, the timing of the seasons all influence rainfall and flooding patterns in complex but real ways. A community with centuries of accumulated astronomical observations, carefully recorded in the orientations of their stone monuments, and centuries of accumulated observations about flooding patterns tied to specific astronomical events, would have been able to make predictions. Not perfect predictions, not the kind of numerical accuracy that modern meteorology aspires to, but the kind of rule-of-thumb predictions that experienced farmers develop through generations of watching the sky and the land together. If the moon rises here, and the last 3 times that happened it rained within 4 days, then it will probably rain soon. Prepare accordingly. This is what we would now call pattern recognition. It is also, at its best, the beginning of science. The systematic observation of natural phenomena over long time periods, the recording of those observations in a medium that outlasts individual human memory, the extraction of predictive rules from the accumulated data. The stone circles are the recording medium. The alignments are the data. The generations of observation are the methodology, and the output is agricultural advantage. The ability to plant and harvest at the right times, the ability to prepare for floods, the ability to make decisions about where to graze animals and when to move them to higher ground, the ability, in the most practical terms possible, to feed your community through another year. Now, I want to address something directly, because the picture I am drawing of stone circles as practical infrastructure, as astronomical observatories and navigational landmarks and water prediction tools and acoustic teaching spaces, might seem to leave no room for the spiritual dimension that has been associated with these sites for as long as people have been writing about them. And I do not think that is right. I do not think the practical and the spiritual were separate categories for the people who built these monuments. The dichotomy that we draw so automatically between science and religion, between the practical and the sacred, is a product of our own culture and our own time. It was not a distinction that existed for people living 4,000 years ago. For them, the sun that told you when to plant your crops was the same sun that governed the cycle of life and death in the wider world. The moon that predicted the tides was the same moon that governed the rhythms of the human body. The stars that helped you navigate across the sea were the same stars that your ancestors had watched from this same hillside. The knowledge encoded in the stone was simultaneously practical and spiritual, because for them those were not different things. What I am arguing against is not the idea that these sites had spiritual significance. Of course they did. What I am arguing against is the reduction of that significance to empty ceremonial performance, to ritual without function, to worship without knowledge. The spiritual dimension of these sites was inseparable from their practical dimension. The priests, if we want to call them that, were also the astronomers. The ceremonies, if we want to call them that, were also the teaching events. The sacred calendar that governed the ritual year was also the agricultural calendar that governed when to plant and when to harvest. Separating those things, calling one primitive religion and the other sophisticated science, does violence to the complexity of what these people actually had. It takes a sophisticated, integrated system of knowledge and divides it artificially, putting part of it in a category we call legitimate and part of it in a category we call superstition. The builders of the stone circles did not make that division, and we should be careful about making it for them. Let me take you to another site, one that is not a stone circle in the conventional sense, but is deeply connected to the same tradition of astronomical knowledge and practical intelligence. Meisho is a chambered tomb on Orkney, built roughly 5,000 years ago, contemporary with the Ring of Brodgar a few kilometers away. From the outside, it looks like a large, grass-covered mound, typical of the Neolithic burial monuments found across Britain, but the interior of Meisho is something else entirely. The chamber is constructed with a precision that still astonishes archaeologists. The walls are built from massive stone slabs, fitted together without mortar, with a tightness and flatness that would not embarrass a modern mason. The corbelled ceiling rises to a height of nearly 4 meters. The proportions of the chamber are elegant and harmonious, but the most remarkable thing about Meisho is what happens there on a specific day each year. At the winter solstice, the shortest day of the year, the setting sun sends its light directly down the entrance passage of Meisho and illuminates the back wall of the chamber. Not the sunrise, as at Stonehenge, the sunset. The dying light of the shortest day reaches into the deepest interior of the monument and lights it up for a period of about 45 minutes before the sun dips below the horizon and the chamber returns to darkness. The entrance passage of Meisho is oriented with extraordinary precision to capture this specific alignment. The builders knew where the sun would set on the winter solstice, to a degree of accuracy that implies careful, long-term observation. They built the passage at exactly the right angle to funnel that light into the chamber. They created an event, a theatrical, overwhelming, precisely timed event that would have been visible to everyone gathered in and around the monument on that day. What was the significance of the winter solstice sunset? In one sense, it marked the turning point of the year, the moment when the days, having grown shorter and shorter since midsummer, would begin to lengthen again. For a community facing the deep cold and darkness of a northern winter, the knowledge that the sun was turning, that warmth and growth would return, that the earth had not abandoned them to permanent darkness, was not a trivial comfort. It was a matter of psychological survival as well as physical survival. The Meisho alignment transformed that abstract astronomical knowledge into immediate physical experience. You did not just know intellectually that the sun was turning. You saw it. You felt it. The light reached into the dark chamber and said, "I am still here. I am still coming back." This is what the great monuments do when they are working as intended. They do not describe the world. They demonstrate it. They take the invisible mechanisms of the sky and make them visible, tangible, present. And they do it in a way that is available to everyone, not just to specialists. The knowledge of the winter solstice alignment at Meisho belongs to the community. It does not require years of study or specialized training to experience and understand. You go to Meisho on the winter solstice, and the monument teaches you, directly, through light. This is pedagogy. This is brilliant, effective, durable, scalable education, and it has been working continuously for 5,000 years. But who were the specialists? Who designed these monuments with their precise alignments and their consistent measurement units and their acoustic properties? Who were the people with the knowledge to do this? We have almost no direct evidence. The architects of the stone circles left no written records, no portraits, no graves that we can identify with confidence as belonging to them. They were invisible, in the sense that their identities have been lost to time. But we can infer certain things about them from the monuments themselves. They were highly trained. The precision of the astronomical alignments in the major stone circles is not something you stumble upon. It requires extensive observation over years, ideally over multiple cycles of the relevant astronomical phenomena. To align a monument correctly to the major lunar standstill, for example, you would need to have observed at least one complete standstill cycle of 18.5 years, and ideally several, before you had enough data to predict with confidence where the moon would be at its extreme. This means that the knowledge necessary to build monuments like Kallanish and Brodgar was not accumulated in a single generation. It was inherited. It was passed down from teachers to students over many generations, accumulating precision and refinement with each cycle of observation and construction. This implies a continuous educational tradition, a school, if you will, though not a school in the sense of a building where children sit in rows, a school in the sense of a living tradition of knowledge transmission, maintained by a group of specialists whose primary role in their communities was to watch, to remember, and to teach. Many researchers have compared this tradition to the Druid orders documented by Roman writers in the 1st century BCE. Julius Caesar, writing about the Gauls and Britons he encountered during his military campaigns, described the Druids as a learned class who were responsible for keeping and transmitting knowledge of natural philosophy, astronomy, and religious lore. He noted that the Druids required students to memorize enormous amounts of material over periods of training that lasted up to 20 years. 20 years of training. For a learned class whose primary responsibilities included astronomical observation and the management of the sacred calendar, the Druids of the 1st century BCE were not the builders of Stonehenge. They came along roughly 2,000 years after the great megalithic monuments were constructed. But the tradition they embodied may have been a continuation of a much older tradition, a tradition that began with the very first people who looked at the sky and understood that it could tell you things you needed to know. And here is something that the Roman writers who described the Druids found remarkable, something that matches perfectly with the picture of the stone circles as nodes in a knowledge network. The Druids, according to Caesar and others, had a tradition of gathering regularly at a central sacred site, the omphalos, or navel of their world, for pan-tribal assemblies. At these assemblies, legal disputes were settled, young students were taught, and astronomical observations were shared and debated. The assemblies were governed by the sacred calendar, which was itself an astronomical artifact, a system for counting and predicting the movements of sun and moon. Replace the word druids with the word stone circle builders. Replace the word omphalos with the word stone circle. Replace the word assemblies with solstice and equinox gatherings. And you have a description that fits perfectly with what the archaeological evidence suggests was happening at the major monument sites in Neolithic Britain. The tradition survived. The gatherings continued. The knowledge was passed down. The monuments accumulated. One generation's additions built on the work of the previous generation until they reached the extraordinary complexity and precision of Stonehenge and Callanish and the Ring of Brodgar. And then, sometime around 1000 BCE, or perhaps a little later, the construction stopped. Why did they stop building? This is one of the most discussed questions in British prehistory, and there is no universally accepted answer. The timing corresponds roughly with the transition from the Bronze Age to the Iron Age, with significant social and cultural changes across Britain and Europe, with the arrival of new populations from the continent, and with a period of climate deterioration that made agriculture considerably more difficult across much of northwestern Europe. Perhaps the knowledge network that had maintained the stone circles was disrupted by social upheaval. Perhaps the tradition of specialist knowledge keepers was broken, either by violence or by the collapse of the agricultural communities that had sustained them. Perhaps the new iron-using cultures that were spreading across Britain had different ways of managing the problems that stone circles had been built to solve. Or perhaps, and this is the most uncomfortable possibility, the knowledge was not entirely lost. Perhaps it continued, in modified forms, through the Druid traditions documented by Roman writers, through the folk practices and beliefs that persisted in the British countryside well into the historical period, through the residual memory of sacred sites and sacred times that the early Christian missionaries found so deeply rooted in the communities they were trying to convert that they had no choice but to incorporate them into the new religion. The stone circles are still there, most of them, at least in some form. Thousands of years of weather and agriculture and human interference have damaged many of them, and some have been destroyed entirely. But enough survive to tell the story if we are willing to listen. And what they tell us, if we stop insisting on the narrow interpretation of religious ritual and open ourselves to the full complexity of what they might represent, is extraordinary. They tell us about a civilization that did not have writing, but developed sophisticated methods of externalizing and transmitting knowledge. A civilization that did not have metal tools but built structures whose precision impresses modern engineers. A civilization that did not have formal institutions but maintained a continent-spanning knowledge network over centuries. A civilization that looked at the sky and understood it deeply enough to build stone computers that worked for thousands of years. That is the real reason Britain has so many stone circles. Not because Neolithic Britons were unusually religious, not because they were primitive people who needed stone temples to communicate with their gods, but because they were smart, because they were observant. Because they understood that knowledge, carefully accumulated and carefully preserved and carefully transmitted, was the difference between survival and extinction in a world where the margin between plenty and famine was measured in weeks. They built the circles because they needed them, because without them, the knowledge would be lost, because the sky does not wait for you to catch up, and the seasons do not negotiate, and the floods come whether you are ready or not. The stone circles are not monuments to their gods, they are monuments to their intelligence. And they are still there, on the hilltops and the islands and the moors, pointing at the sky, waiting patiently for us to ask the right questions. Let me go deeper into the mechanics of what these structures could actually do, because I think most people, even people who are genuinely interested in ancient monuments, have a somewhat fuzzy picture of what astronomical observation actually looks like in practice. When we talk about a stone circle being aligned to the midsummer sunrise, what does that actually mean? How does it work? Stand in the center of a stone circle on any morning. Look at the horizon. If the circle has been oriented correctly, you will notice that specific stones or pairs of stones frame specific portions of the horizon. The horizon, from any fixed viewpoint, is divided by the stone's intersections. Some sections of the horizon are visible through gaps between stones. Some are blocked by the stones themselves. On a specific day of the year, the sun rises in a specific place on the horizon. As the year progresses, that rising point moves gradually along the horizon, reaching its most northerly position at the summer solstice and its most southerly position at the winter solstice. On the equinoxes, it rises due east. Now, if the stones have been placed carefully, the midsummer sunrise will appear in a specific gap between two specific stones. Not anywhere in the horizon, not approximately in that direction, exactly there. The stone frames the sunrise. If you are standing in the center of the circle, watching for that framing, you know with certainty whether the sun has reached its solstice position or not. There is no ambiguity. Either the sun rises in the gap or it does not. If it does not, the solstice has not yet arrived. If it rises exactly in the gap, the solstice is today. This is more accurate than any method of tracking the solstice by eye alone would be. The human eye is good at estimating direction, but it is not precise enough to detect the tiny day-to-day shift in the sun's rising position in the weeks approaching the solstice. The shift is too small. Without a fixed reference point, without a stone framing the horizon, you will be off by several days in identifying the exact solstice. Several days might not seem important, but several days in an agricultural calendar, several days in determining when to plant your grain or when to expect the late frosts, can be the difference between a successful harvest and a ruined one. The stones give you precision. They turn a fuzzy observation into a binary one. Today or not today. Solstice or not solstice. Plant or wait. And because the stones are permanent, this precision does not degrade over time. The same observation that you make at the summer solstice this year is the same observation your grandchildren will make 50 years from now, and your great-great-grandchildren will make 200 years from now. The circle does not forget. It does not die. It does not lose its precision through age or illness or the fading of memory. It is, in the most literal sense, a machine for preserving knowledge. Now extend that to the full complexity of what a sophisticated stone circle like Stonehenge or Callanish was doing. These were not just tracking one astronomical event. They were tracking multiple events simultaneously, multiple alignments built into the same structure, pointing at different phenomena that were relevant to different aspects of the community's practical life. The solstice alignments, which told you the most extreme positions of the sun. The equinox alignments, which told you the pivot points of the agricultural year. The lunar alignments, which told you about tides and flooding cycles. The stellar alignments, which are less well understood but which may have been tracking the rising and setting of specific bright stars that served as markers for particular seasons or events. All of this information, embedded in the geometry of a single structure, readable to anyone who had been taught how to read it. The teaching itself would have been relatively straightforward. You stand here, at the center. You look in that direction. When the moon rises in that gap between those two stones, it means this. When the sun sets behind that stone, it means this. When you can see the star between those two upright stones just before dawn, it means this. These are simple rules. They do not require years of mathematical training to understand. They require only that you know where to stand and what to look for. The complexity has been built into the monument by the specialists who designed it. The end user, the farmer, or fisherman, or trader who consults the monument, simply reads it. This is the genius of the design. The hard work, the centuries of observation and calculation that went into determining the alignments, has been done once by the specialists. And then, encoded in stone, it becomes available to everyone, forever, without anyone needing to repeat the work. It is the same principle that underlies any good piece of engineering. The user does not need to understand the engineering in order to benefit from it. You do not need to understand the mathematics of combustion to drive a car. You do not need to understand the physics of electromagnetic induction to use a telephone. The knowledge has been encoded into the machine, and the machine works whether or not the user understands how. The stone circles are machines. Astonishingly durable, astonishingly precise machines, built to do a specific job, and doing that job reliably for thousands of years. I want to spend some time now on a question that does not get asked often enough in discussions of stone circles, but that becomes crucial once you accept the practical interpretation. The question is this: who maintained them? Buildings deteriorate. Monuments crumble. The effort required to build a stone circle does not end when the last stone is raised. The landscape around a stone circle changes over time. Trees grow up and obscure horizon views. Heather and bracken encroach on the viewing platform. The stones themselves can shift, either through frost heave or through the slow, inevitable movement of the ground beneath them. An astronomical observatory that is not maintained loses its precision. If the horizon view is obscured, the alignments no longer function. If the stones shift, the calibration is lost. If nobody is watching, nobody catches these problems before they become permanent. Someone had to maintain the circles. Someone had to watch them, repair them, clear the views, check the alignments after severe winters, notice when a stone had moved and correct it. Someone had to carry the institutional knowledge of what the circle was for and how to check that it was still working correctly. This means a continuous community commitment to the monument, spanning generations, possibly centuries. It means that the role of stone circle keeper was a real role in the social structure of Neolithic and Bronze Age communities, probably a prestigious role, certainly a specialist role, requiring knowledge and skill and dedication. And it means that when archaeologists find evidence of repeated activity at stone circle sites, recurring fires, recurring feasts, recurring deposits of objects in the ground near the stones, they are not necessarily looking at religious ritual repeated generation after generation out of inertia or superstition. They may be looking at the maintenance schedule, the annual or seasonal checkup, when the community gathered at the monument to verify that it was still working correctly, to update their astronomical records with the latest observations, to teach the next generation what to look for and how to interpret what they saw. The feasting is the staff party. The fires are the work lights. The ceremony is the annual report. I realize that sounds somewhat prosaic, and I want to be clear again that I am not trying to strip these sites of their power or their wonder. The integration of practical function with communal celebration is not prosaic. It is, in fact, how the most important functions in any society tend to be organized. The harvest festival and the agricultural calendar are the same thing. The Christmas dinner and the midwinter celebration of the sun's return are the same thing. The form changes, the function persists. What I am arguing is that the function persisted here, in the stone circles, for a very long time, longer than any other infrastructure humanity has ever built, and that the reason it persisted is that it worked. The circles worked. The alignments were accurate. The calendars they enabled were reliable. The agricultural advantage they provided was real. That is not religion in the dismissive sense. That is civilization. Let us now visit one of the stone circles that archaeologists have been most intensively studying in recent years, a site that has transformed our understanding of what these monuments meant socially and economically, not just astronomically. The Ness of Brodgar is a site on Orkney that has only been known to archaeology since 2003, when a ploughed field near the Ring of Brodgar and the stones of Stenness began to reveal traces of extraordinary complexity. Excavations that have been ongoing since 2008, led by archaeologist Nick Card, have uncovered something that nobody expected. The Ness of Brodgar is not a stone circle, it is a complex of buildings. A large, elaborate settlement occupying a promontory between two locks, surrounded by a massive enclosure wall containing at least 12 substantial stone-built structures, some of them decorated with painted stone and the remnants of complex decorative schemes. This is not a ceremonial site in the sense of an empty sacred space. This is a working complex, a place where people lived, worked, cooked, and carried out activities that required specialized equipment and specialized knowledge. The animal bones found at the site show evidence of feasting on a massive scale. Cattle and pigs, mostly, in quantities that imply the slaughter and consumption of hundreds of animals at specific events. But the really extraordinary thing about the Ness of Brodgar is what it tells us about the social organization of Neolithic Orkney. This was not a local operation. The pottery found at the site, the tools, the decorative materials, they come from across Orkney and from the Scottish mainland. The Ness of Brodgar was drawing people, resources and materials from a wide area, concentrating them in one place, processing them in ways that we do not yet fully understand, and distributing the outputs of that process back outward. This is an economic center, a redistribution hub, a place that sat at the heart of a regional exchange system, bringing things in and sending things out, not just physically but informationally. If the stone circles are the observatories and the teaching stations, and the navigational waypoints of a knowledge network, the Ness of Brodgar looks like it might have been the administrative center. The place where the specialists who maintained the network gathered to compare notes, resolve disputes, train the next generation of knowledge keepers. The dating evidence suggests that the Ness of Brodgar was in intensive use for roughly 500 years, from around 3200 BCE to around 2700 BCE, after which it appears to have been deliberately and dramatically decommissioned. The buildings were systematically demolished. A massive feast was held, during which an estimated 400 cattle were slaughtered and consumed. And then the site was sealed, covered, buried beneath a layer of debris, and abandoned. Why? What happened around 2700 BCE on Orkney that led to the deliberate closure of this remarkable complex? We do not know with certainty. But 2700 BCE is also, roughly, the period when significant new populations begin arriving in Britain from the continent, bringing with them the new technologies of the beaker culture, the sophisticated pottery, the early metalworking, the different social organization, the different burial practices. These new arrivals did not eliminate the existing population. Genetic evidence shows that there was considerable mixing, but they did transform British society. The old Neolithic order gave way to something new. Perhaps the knowledge network centered on Orcadian sites like the Ness of Brodgar was a casualty of that transition. Perhaps the specialists who maintained it were absorbed into the new social order, their knowledge partly preserved and partly lost. Perhaps the elaborate administrative infrastructure that the Neolithic knowledge keepers had built was deliberately shut down, either by themselves in a controlled decommissioning, or by the new arrivals who did not understand or value what it had been for. The final feast at the Ness of Brodgar, 400 cattle consumed in a single event, has the feeling of a closure ceremony, a ending, a conscious decision to stop, to mark the end of something, to acknowledge that a chapter was over. What came after was different, but not discontinuous. The stone circles continued to be used, if not always to be built. Stonehenge itself was at its most architecturally elaborate in the Beaker period, after the arrival of these continental newcomers. The astronomical alignments were not forgotten. The knowledge persisted, at least in part, at least for a while. But the institutional framework that had produced and maintained the knowledge, whatever it had been, was gone. And without it, the knowledge began to fade, to fragment, to drift toward the category that we now call myth. The great stone circles still pointed at the solstices, but the people who gathered at them no longer fully understood why. The ritual persisted after the knowledge behind it had become obscure. And gradually, inevitably, the practical function was forgotten entirely, and what remained was the ceremony, the mystery, the story of ancient gods and magical transformations. The stones became altars, because nobody remembered that they had been clocks. It is a kind of tragedy, if you think about it. One of the greatest intellectual achievements of the ancient world, a network of precision astronomical instruments maintained across an entire landscape by a sophisticated class of specialists, reduced over the course of a few centuries to a collection of mysterious old rocks that people told stories about. And the stories were not nothing. The stories preserved something. The memory of significance, the sense that these places mattered, that they were not just random arrangements of stone but intentional constructions with meaning. The stories kept people coming back, generation after generation, to places that would otherwise have been plundered for building material or simply forgotten. But the stories also hid the knowledge. They replaced understanding with reverence. They kept people at a respectful, superstitious distance from structures that had been designed to be used, to be read, to be consulted and checked and maintained. The temple atmosphere that settled over the stone circles in the centuries after the knowledge behind them had faded was, in a sense, the enemy of the knowledge. You cannot learn to read a monument if you are afraid to approach it. And so the circles became sacred mysteries instead of useful tools, and the useful knowledge was lost. Until, slowly, painstakingly, archaeologists and engineers and astronomers began to ask the right questions again. Until people like Alexander Thom started measuring things and found that the measurements meant something. Until people like Rupert Till started listening and found that the acoustics were not accidental. Until people like Nick Card started digging and found that the stories they had been telling about stone circles as isolated ceremonial sites were radically incomplete. The recovery of this knowledge is still ongoing. There are stone circles that have never been properly surveyed. There are alignments that have never been calculated. There are acoustic properties that have never been measured. There is an enormous amount that we do not yet know about what these monuments were and what they were for. But the direction of the inquiry has changed. The question is no longer simply, what did these people believe? The question is, what did they know? And how did they know it? And how did they use it? Those are harder questions. They require more effort, more precision, more willingness to take the evidence seriously rather than fitting it into preconceived categories. But they are the right questions. And the answers, as they slowly emerge, are reconfiguring our picture of the past in ways that are not just intellectually interesting, but genuinely moving. These were not primitive people stumbling blindly through a mysterious universe, reaching toward their gods in fear and incomprehension. These were careful, intelligent, observant human beings who looked at the world around them and built tools to understand it, who preserved their knowledge in the only medium durable enough to survive for millennia, who organized their communities around the shared project of knowing as well as the shared project of surviving. They were, in the most fundamental sense, like us. Let us go to a stone circle that illustrates a different dimension of this story. A dimension that takes us away from the dramatic skyline monuments of Orkney and the Outer Hebrides and brings us into the middle of the English countryside, where the evidence is smaller scale and more subtle, but in some ways even more revealing. The Stanton Drew stone circles are in Somerset, in the southwest of England, a few kilometres from the town of Bath. They are not as well known as they deserve to be. There are actually 3 separate stone circles at the Stanton Drew site, along with several outlying stones and the remains of what appears to have been an avenue of stones similar to the one at Avebury. The largest of the 3 circles is the second largest stone circle in Britain after Avebury, with a diameter of roughly 113 metres. But what makes Stanton Drew remarkable is not what you can see on the surface, it is what is underneath. In 1997, a survey using magnetometry, a non-invasive technique that detects subtle variations in the magnetic properties of the ground caused by buried features, revealed something extraordinary. Beneath the visible stone circle, invisible from the surface, there was a pattern of dark spots in the magnetometry data. 9 concentric rings of posts, arranged around the center of the circle, forming a pattern that had been completely invisible until the magnetometry survey. These post holes represented a massive wooden structure built before the stone circle that replaced it. Perhaps 1,000 posts in total, arranged in a precise concentric pattern, forming what would have been an enormous roofed or semi-roofed structure, something like a circular building, roughly 90 meters in diameter. The scale of this wooden structure was staggering. It would have been one of the largest buildings in prehistoric Britain, rivaling in its ambition and complexity anything built in stone, and it would have been acoustically extraordinary. The combination of the concentric post rings, which would have functioned as sound baffles, reflecting and modifying sound in complex ways, with the presumably thatched or plank roof, would have created an interior acoustic environment quite different from anything you might experience in an ordinary open-air gathering. This was a building designed for gatherings, for large numbers of people assembled in a covered space, for activities that benefited from a controlled acoustic environment. For speech, possibly. For music, certainly. For teaching. And it was later replaced by a stone circle. The wood was removed or rotted away, and stones were erected in its place, not following the same concentric ring pattern of the wooden structure, but creating a different kind of monument at the same site. Why replace wood with stone? The obvious answer is durability. Wood rots, stone does not. If you have a site that you want to remain functional and findable for centuries rather than decades, you build in stone. The transition from the wooden structure to the stone circle at Stanton Drew is a transition from the temporary to the permanent, from the easily modified to the fixed, from the local to the landscape scale, and the astronomical alignments that the stone circle encodes, which are present at Stanton Drew as at other sites, are precisely the kind of information that benefits from being encoded permanently. You do not need to recalculate the direction of the midsummer sunrise every generation. You just need to preserve the marker that tells you where it is. And stone preserves it better than wood. Stanton Drew is not unusual in showing evidence of earlier wooden structures beneath the stone circles. At several sites, notably Stonehenge itself, post holes predating the stone monument have been found. Timber circles that were precursors to the familiar stone arrangements. The Neolithic builders did not jump straight to stone, they experimented in wood first. And only when they had a design that worked, a set of alignments that were accurate, and a spatial arrangement that served its function, did they rebuild in the permanent medium. This is engineering practice. This is how you build something that matters. You do it in cheap material first, verify that it works, then rebuild it in the material that will last. The standard narrative of stone circles as sacred monuments that emerged fully formed from religious inspiration does not accommodate this kind of iterative, practical design process. But the evidence for it is widespread and consistent. These structures were designed, they were tested, they were refined, and then they were built to last. Now I want to turn to something that has been lurking at the edges of this discussion for a while. The question of who was actually making these decisions and what kind of social structure supported the knowledge-keeping tradition. We know that Neolithic Britain was not egalitarian. The burial evidence, in particular, shows clear signs of social hierarchy. Some individuals were buried with significant quantities of grave goods, stone tools, pottery, jewelry, indications of wealth and status. Others were buried with nothing, or not given formal burial at all. The emergence of elaborate communal tombs, like the long barrows and chambered cairns that preceded the stone circles in time, suggests a society organized around the memory and authority of specific ancestral lineages. The specialists who designed and maintained the stone circles would have occupied a particular position in this hierarchy. They had knowledge that was useful to everyone, but possessed by few. They had skills that required long training. They had authority derived from their ability to predict events, to explain the behavior of the sky, to manage the calendar that governed everyone's agricultural decisions. In societies with this kind of specialist knowledge class, a characteristic pattern tends to emerge. The knowledge becomes a source of power. The ability to predict the solstice, to announce the new year, to determine when the planting season begins is not just useful knowledge, it is political power. Whoever controls the calendar controls the community's economic decisions. The priests of ancient Egypt derived enormous power from their ability to predict the annual flooding of the Nile, which was tied to astronomical phenomena that they had carefully documented over centuries. The Maya astronomer priests of Mesoamerica wielded authority derived from their mastery of the astronomical calendar. The Druid class of pre-Roman Britain, as described by Roman writers, held significant political and judicial authority that was inseparable from their role as keepers of astronomical and natural knowledge. The designers of Britain's stone circles may have been playing a similar game, not just preserving knowledge for the benefit of the community, though that was certainly part of it, but also consolidating power through the control of that knowledge. This would explain something that is sometimes noted about the major stone circles, which is that they seem more elaborate than strictly necessary for their presumed functions. Stonehenge, for example, is an extraordinarily complex structure. The precision of its construction, the difficulty of transporting the stones, the sophistication of its multiple overlapping alignments, all of this goes considerably beyond what you would need for a basic agricultural calendar. A simpler monument could have done the job. Unless the complexity was not just about function, unless it was also about display, about demonstrating, to every community that gathered at the site, the sophistication and power of the knowledge class that had designed it, about saying, in stone and on a landscape scale, we know things you do not know, we can do things you cannot do. Our authority is written in the sky. This is how institutions work. They do not just provide services, they also perform their authority. Governments build impressive buildings, not just to house their bureaucrats, but to demonstrate the power of the state. Universities build impressive libraries and laboratories, not just to store books and conduct experiments, but to embody the prestige of knowledge. The major stone circles may have been doing the same thing, performing the authority of the knowledge class in a form that was visible to everyone for hundreds of kilometers and for thousands of years. This interpretation, adds a layer of complexity to the picture without contradicting any of the practical interpretations we have been discussing. The circles were practical, and they were political. Both things were true simultaneously. The knowledge was real, the power derived from it was also real, and the magnificent stone structures were both the tools that maintained the knowledge and the symbols that embodied the power. Now let us turn to one of the strangest and most under-discussed aspects of the stone circle tradition, the way it ended. We noted earlier that stone circle construction ceased around 1000 BCE, after which existing circles continued to be maintained and used, but no new major monuments were built. And we noted some possible explanations for this: the arrival of new populations, climate deterioration, social disruption. But there is something else happening at roughly this time that deserves attention. The knowledge class that designed and maintained the stone circles was, if our interpretation is correct, an oral tradition. Their knowledge was not written down. It was transmitted from teacher to student through direct teaching, through memorization, through the living transmission of complex bodies of information that had been accumulated over centuries. And the key point about an oral tradition is that it requires continuity. It requires an unbroken chain of transmission from teacher to student. If that chain is broken anywhere, the knowledge is not recoverable from elsewhere. It is simply gone. The archaeological evidence suggests that the period around 1200 to 800 BCE was a time of considerable disruption across much of Europe and the Mediterranean. This is the period known as the Late Bronze Age collapse, a poorly understood but clearly real event that saw the end of several major Bronze Age civilizations, the disruption of long-distance trade networks, population movements, and social upheaval across a wide area. The causes are still debated: climate change, drought, disease, internal social breakdown, external invasion, probably some combination of all of these. Britain was not immune to these disruptions. The archaeological record shows evidence of significant social change during this period: the abandonment of settlement sites, changes in burial practices, the end of long-distance exchange networks that had been functioning since the Neolithic. If the knowledge tradition that maintained the stone circles was dependent on stable, well-connected communities and reliable long-distance communication networks, the disruptions of the Late Bronze Age collapse would have been devastating to it. The chain of transmission could have been broken not by a single catastrophe, but by the gradual attrition of a system under stress. A community here that could no longer maintain its monument. A knowledge keeper there who had no student to pass the knowledge to. A network that had once covered an entire landscape, slowly developing gaps and then holes and then, ultimately, silence. What remained, after the knowledge had gone, was the ceremony, the habit of gathering at the stones at certain times of year without the full understanding of why those times had been chosen. The tradition of the fire at midwinter, which had once been a calibration check for the solstice alignment, becoming a ritual in its own right, detached from its original function. The sacred character of the sites, which had once derived from their practical importance, surviving as a kind of institutional inertia, as the memory of significance even after the reason for that significance had been forgotten. This is how knowledge dies. Not suddenly, not completely, but gradually, piece by piece, until what remains is a silhouette, a shape without content, a form without function. And then someone comes along, many centuries later, and looks at the silhouette and says, "What were they worshipping?" The word worship says something about us, not about them. It places them in a category that satisfies our need to explain their behavior without requiring us to credit them with the kind of sophisticated, practical intelligence that we prefer to reserve for ourselves and for the civilizations we directly inherit from. Ancient Greeks and Romans, they were doing science. Ancient Egyptians, they were doing engineering. But ancient Britons, they were doing religion. Why? Because ancient Britons did not leave us texts. Because they did not build cities we can excavate systematically. Because their monuments are made of stone in open landscapes rather than papyrus in sealed rooms or clay tablets in the ruins of cities. Because their successors, the Roman writers who first described British prehistory to a literate audience, had political reasons for portraying the native Britons as superstitious barbarians whose conquest was therefore both necessary and beneficial. The story of ancient Britons as simple folk performing primitive religious rituals is not an archaeologically derived story. It is a politically motivated story that was told by people who wanted to justify their conquest of the British Isles, and then uncritically repeated by subsequent generations who found it a comfortable explanation for ruins they did not know how to interpret. The stones were easier to explain as temples than as observatories. Temples are for people who do not understand the world. Observatories are for people who do. And the story of stone circles as religious sites served another purpose as well. It placed them safely in the past. It made them relics of a superstition that had been superseded by the superior knowledge of the present. It domesticated the mystery, transformed something genuinely challenging into something merely quaint. The observatory's interpretation does the opposite. It makes the mystery larger, not smaller. If the stone circles are temples, they are interesting but safe. If they are astronomical instruments, they are extraordinary evidence of intellectual achievement that we are only now beginning to understand fully. And that is unsettling. It requires us to revise our understanding of what prehistoric people were capable of in ways that push against some very deep and comfortable assumptions. We like to think of ourselves as the culmination of a long upward progress, each generation smarter and more capable than the last. The arrow of history pointing toward us, the most sophisticated civilization that has ever existed. The stone circles complicate that story. They suggest that sophistication is not always additive, that knowledge can be lost as well as gained, that the people of 4,000 years ago were, in important respects, doing things we cannot fully replicate today, that we have gained much since then, but we have also lost some things that we may not fully appreciate. The builders of the stone circles could look at a field of stars and tell you, with precision, where the moon would rise 18 months from now. We have lost that skill entirely, replaced it with technology that does the calculation for us. The builders of the stone circles could move 200-kilometer consignments of stone across a landscape without wheeled transport. We have replaced that capability with cranes and trucks. The builders of the stone circles could maintain a knowledge tradition across a landscape for 1,000 years without writing it down. We have replaced that capability with books and digital storage. All of these replacements are genuine advances. No one is suggesting we would be better off without wheels or computers or writing. But there is something worth noticing in the replacements. They are all more dependent on infrastructure. They all require more support systems, more stable conditions, more organizational complexity to function. The stone circles were robust. They worked whether the economy was strong or weak, whether trade routes were open or closed, whether the political system was stable or in upheaval. You just needed to know where to stand and when to look. The knowledge they embodied was durable in a way that very little of our current knowledge is. It was encoded in the physical landscape in a form that required no maintenance, no power supply, no institutional support. It was there, permanently, for anyone who knew how to read it. We have lost the ability to read it. And in losing that ability, we have lost something that the builders of the circles understood, and that we are only beginning to appreciate again. The sky is still there. The sun still rises in the same place on the solstice. The moon still completes its 18-and-a-half-year cycle. The stars still rise and set with the same precision they always had. The circles still point at all of it. We just stopped looking. Let me bring you to a stone circle that has a story I find particularly haunting. Not haunting in the ghost story sense, though it has certainly generated its share of ghost stories over the centuries, but haunting in the sense of leaving a persistent resonance, a feeling that something important happened here that we have not fully understood. The Grey Weathers are a pair of stone circles on Dartmoor in Devon, in the southwest of England. They are unusual because they are two circles placed side by side, virtually touching, on a high open moor at an altitude of roughly 450 meters. The name Grey Weathers comes from a piece of folklore. Seen from a distance in certain light conditions, the stones resemble a flock of grey sheep, and local tradition held that farmers were sometimes fooled into attempting to purchase what appeared to be a large flock of sheep on the moor, only to discover, on closer inspection, that the sheep were stones. That is the surface story, the local joke, the piece of folklore that has attached itself to an ancient site and gives it a human texture that the raw archaeological record cannot provide. But beneath that surface story is something more interesting. The two circles of the grey weathers are oriented differently. The northern circle is aligned to the midsummer sunrise and the midwinter sunset, the classic solstice alignment. The southern circle is aligned differently, to a point on the southern horizon where the moon reaches a particular position in its cycle. Two circles, at the same site, tracking two different celestial phenomena. The sun and the moon, separately encoded in stone, placed side by side on a high moor. Why two circles rather than one? A single circle with multiple alignments, as at Stonehenge, can encode multiple phenomena in a single monument. Why the effort and the resource cost of two separate circles? One possibility is that the two circles were built at different times, by different communities, each adding their own contribution to a site that had already been established as significant. The southern circle came first, the lunar alignment, and later a second community added the northern circle with its solar alignment. This would make the grey weathers a kind of collaborative monument. Different knowledge traditions contributing to the same site over time, each adding their own set of astronomical references without necessarily disturbing the existing structure. And if that is what happened here, it might be happening at other sites too. Many stone circles show evidence of modification over time. Stones added, stones removed, outer rings added to inner circles, avenues constructed leading to and from existing monuments. These modifications have often been interpreted as evidence of changing religious practices, new ritual requirements superseding old ones. But they could equally be interpreted as evidence of accumulating knowledge. Each generation of knowledge keepers adding their observations to the existing monument. The circle growing in complexity as the astronomical database encoded within it expanded, the stone circles as living documents. Not static monuments to a single moment of religious inspiration, but evolving records of observation added to and refined over the centuries as the knowledge tradition that maintained them accumulated more data. This is a more dynamic picture than the one usually offered. It makes the stone circles less monumental and more, in a sense, alive. They were not finished things, crystallized in the past. They were ongoing projects, until they stopped being ongoing projects, because the tradition that maintained them collapsed. And then they became what we see today, frozen in whatever state they were in when the last addition was made and the last caretaker put down their tools and walked away. We are looking at the last snapshot of a long conversation, and we are trying to reconstruct what was being said. The conversation was about time, about how to live in relation to the cycles of the sky and the seasons of the earth, about how to know and how to act on what you know, about how to preserve knowledge that is hard-won and easily lost. These are not ancient concerns. They are not prehistoric concerns that we have moved beyond. They are concerns that every generation has faced, and that we face as acutely now as people have ever faced them. The information landscape changes. The ways that knowledge is stored and transmitted change. The institutions that are supposed to preserve important knowledge fail and have to be rebuilt. The knowledge that seemed secure turns out to be fragile. The builders of the stone circles understood all of this. They understood it so well that they found a solution that lasted for thousands of years. Not perfectly, not without loss, but astonishingly well, given what they were working with. And the lesson they offer is not a lesson about religion, it is a lesson about knowledge. About what knowledge is and what it requires. About the effort and the organization and the long-term commitment that goes into preserving the things that matter most. The stone circles are there, still pointing at the sky, still encoding the alignments that their builders spent lifetimes calibrating. We just need to look again, more carefully this time, with better questions. Let me take you to another corner of the British Isles, where the stone circle tradition took on a form that is, in some ways, even more puzzling than the great monuments of Orkney or Wiltshire. Ireland has stone circles too, many of them concentrated particularly in the south and west of the country, in counties Cork and Kerry and Galway. But Irish stone circles have a characteristic that distinguishes them from most of their British counterparts. They are usually small, most of them under 20 meters in diameter, and they have a consistent architectural feature that is almost entirely absent from the stone circles of mainland Britain. In Irish stone circles, particularly the type known as recumbent stone circles in Cork and Kerry, one stone in the circle is always laid flat rather than standing upright. This recumbent stone is always the largest stone in the circle, and it is always positioned in the southwest of the circle, oriented toward the part of the sky where the moon reaches its lowest position in the monthly cycle. The recumbent stone circles of Ireland are tracking something specific about the moon, something different from the major lunar standstill alignments of the Scottish circles. They are tracking the monthly motion of the moon, the regular oscillation between the moon's highest and lowest positions in the sky as it moves through its 29.5-day cycle. This is a different kind of astronomical information, less dramatic than the major lunar standstill, less obviously connected to long-term agricultural planning, but potentially equally useful for different purposes. The monthly lunar cycle has direct effects on the behavior of animals, on the growth patterns of certain plants, on human biological rhythms, and most importantly for a coastal community, on the tides. The tides of the Irish Sea and the Atlantic coast of Ireland are among the most complex tidal systems in the world, influenced by the interaction of Atlantic Ocean dynamics with the geography of the Irish coastline and the bathymetry, the depth profile, of the surrounding seas. For a community that depended on fishing, on harvesting shellfish from coastal rocks, on moving goods between settlements by boat, understanding tidal patterns was critical, and tidal patterns are lunar patterns. The highest tides come at new moon and full moon. The lowest tides come at the quarter phases. Spring tides and neap tides alternate on a monthly schedule, tied directly to the moon's position relative to the earth and sun. The recumbent stone circles of Ireland may have been used to track the moon's monthly position with enough precision to predict tidal patterns days in advance. Not the dramatic 18-year standstill of the Scottish monuments. The everyday, practical, monthly rhythm of the tides. This would make Irish stone circles, at least the recumbent type, something like tide tables encoded in stone, portable, durable, readable by anyone who had been taught the system. Not portable in the sense of movable, obviously. They are very much not movable. But portable in the sense of accessible to multiple communities who could visit the circle and consult it. A fisherman who knew how to read the recumbent stone circle in his region could tell you, from the current position of the moon in the sky and the orientation of the recumbent stone, whether the tide tomorrow morning would be high or low, and approximately how high or low. He could tell you whether conditions would be suitable for a particular kind of fishing. He could tell you whether the rocks that are only exposed at very low tides, the rocks where the best shellfish grow, would be accessible this week or next week. This is practical navigation information, the kind of information that the sailors and fishermen of the Atlantic coast of Ireland needed every single day of their working lives, and it was encoded permanently in a stone structure that would outlast any individual knowledge keeper and preserve the system even through periods of social disruption and cultural change. There is something quietly beautiful about this, if you think about it. Something moving about the idea of a community of Atlantic coast fishermen 4,000 years ago, building a small stone circle at the edge of their territory, carefully positioning the recumbent stone to align with the moon at its monthly low, and thereby giving their descendants a tool that would help them understand the tides for as long as the stones stood. They were thinking about the future, not the next year or the next decade, but the next century and beyond. They were making a permanent investment in the knowledge of people they would never meet, who would not know their names, who would inherit a tool without knowing who had made it. That is generosity on a geological timescale, and it is the opposite of what the standard narrative gives us. The standard narrative of stone circles as ritual sites implies that they were built for the builders, for the spiritual and social needs of the community that erected them. Built to honor the ancestors, to appease the gods, to mark the sacred status of particular individuals. The practical interpretation suggests something different. It suggests that the major motivation for building these structures was not backward-looking but forward-looking, not ancestor worship but future service, not honoring the past but equipping the future. That is a different kind of civilization, a civilization that thought in terms of centuries rather than generations. that invested resources in infrastructure that would not fully pay off until the people who built it were long dead. That understood, in some deep and practical sense, that knowledge is a gift from the dead to the living, and that the only way to ensure the gift arrives is to encode it in something permanent. This thinking is not alien to us. We do it too, sometimes. We plant trees we will not live to see mature. We build bridges that will serve communities for 100 years. We write books in the hope that someone will read them long after we are gone. But we do it at the margins. We do it as a gesture, an aspiration, a hope. The builders of the stone circles appear to have done it systematically, deliberately, as a central organizing principle of their civilization. The circles are their legacy. And they are still working, not perfectly, not as originally intended. The knowledge of how to read them has been partly lost. The community of practice that maintained and used them has been gone for 3,000 years. But the alignments are still there. The structures are still standing, most of them. The astronomical phenomena they point at are still happening, as regular as they ever were. All that is missing is the people who know how to look, and slowly, that is changing. The modern revival of interest in the astronomical dimensions of stone circles is not just a matter of academic curiosity. It connects to a broader cultural shift in how we think about our relationship to the natural world and to the cycles of time. The growing popularity of solstice and equinox gatherings at stone circle sites, Stonehenge most prominently, is often treated as a kind of New Age appropriation of ancient sites. And there is certainly an element of that. The motivations of people gathering at Stonehenge for the midsummer sunrise are complex and varied, not all of them grounded in the kind of careful, astronomical reasoning we have been discussing. But there is something genuine in it too. A recognition, however inchoate, that these sites were intended to be used at these specific times. A reaching back toward the original function, even without a full understanding of what that function was. The gatherings at the solstices feel right to people because the monuments were designed to be used at the solstices. The stones are doing what they were built to do. And the more people gather at these sites, with genuine curiosity about what they are actually for, the more likely it becomes that the knowledge of how to read them will be recovered, or at least approximated, by the collective intelligence of many observers comparing notes. That is not so different from how the knowledge was originally accumulated in the first place. Through long observation, collective discussion, the slow accumulation of understanding across many minds and many generations, the stone circles are still teaching, just more slowly now, and to students who have to start from scratch. Let me spend some time on a question that I find genuinely fascinating and that I do not think receives enough attention in discussions of stone circles. The question of failures. We have been talking about stone circles as if they were uniformly successful achievements, precision instruments built by expert designers and properly maintained by competent successors. But of course, that is not how building projects actually work. Projects fail, plans go wrong. Sometimes the finished structure does not do what it was designed to do. How would you know if a stone circle had failed? If its alignments were slightly off, if the calculations had been slightly wrong, if the site had been chosen without quite enough care for the sightlines. In most cases, you would not be able to tell just by looking at it. A stone circle with slightly incorrect alignments looks almost identical to one with perfect alignments. Without measuring precisely, without doing the calculations, without spending nights at the site tracking astronomical events, you cannot tell from the outside whether it is working or not. And here is an uncomfortable thought. If you could not tell from the outside whether a stone circle was working, neither could the community that built it. At least not immediately. It might take several years of observation to determine whether the solstice alignment was accurate, decades perhaps, to establish whether the lunar predictions were reliable. If the designers of a particular circle had made a mistake, the community that built it might have been using incorrect astronomical information for years before the error became apparent. And once the error was identified, it might or might not have been possible to correct it. Moving standing stones is enormously difficult. The easiest correction would be to add new stones that modified the alignment, which may explain some of the modifications that are visible at many stone circle sites. The modifications at Stonehenge in particular have been extensively studied, and the picture that emerges is of multiple phases of construction and reconstruction that span more than 1,000 years. each phase modifying the existing monument in ways that sometimes improve the alignments and sometimes complicate them. This is not the picture of a single inspired design executed all at once. It is the picture of an iterative process, of trial and error, of learning by doing. Engineering projects look like that. Scientific instruments look like that. Religious monuments do not look like that. Religious monuments, once completed, are finished. They are not subsequently modified because the design turned out to have technical flaws. The history of Stonehenge's construction, with its multiple phases and its modifications and its apparent improvements over time, is a history of engineering refinement. Of a project that was never quite finished, because the standards being applied to it kept getting higher as the knowledge of its builders improved. This is a profoundly human story, and it is a completely different story from the one we were told. Let me take you further into the landscape around Stonehenge, because the stone circle itself is only one part of a much larger complex of monuments that together tell a more complete story about what this landscape was used for. Stonehenge sits within a landscape that has been modified by human activity over a period of roughly 5,000 years. Surrounding it, within a radius of a few kilometers, there are dozens of other monuments. Long barrows, the earliest, dating from the earliest Neolithic period, roughly 3,500 BCE. Round barrows, later burial mounds, thousands of them, clustering on the ridges and hilltops around Stonehenge in numbers that are quite extraordinary. The cursus, a pair of parallel earthwork banks roughly 3 kilometers long and 100 meters wide, whose function has puzzled archaeologists for 2 centuries. Durrington Walls, a massive circular earthwork several times larger than Stonehenge, associated with a settlement that housed thousands of people during the construction period. This is not a single sacred site. This is a landscape-scale complex of monuments, built and used over millennia, serving multiple functions simultaneously. The long barrows are the earliest. They are communal tombs, built to house the remains of multiple generations of the dead. But they are not just tombs. Their orientations, which archaeologists have only recently begun to analyze systematically, show a clear preference for alignments with the midsummer sunrise and the midwinter sunset. The dead are oriented with the sun. The tombs face the solstices. This could be purely symbolic, a religious statement about the connection between death and the turning of the year. The sun dies each winter and is reborn each summer. The dead, oriented with the sun, participate in that cycle, but it could also be practical. If the long barrows were used as reference points in a landscape-scale astronomical observation system, their consistent orientations would be functionally important, as well as symbolically powerful. You could use the direction of a long barrow as a quick check on the direction of the midsummer sunrise, without needing to wait for a clear dawn. The landscape around Stonehenge begins to look like a coordinate system, multiple fixed points, each with known orientations, that together allow an observer moving through the landscape to determine their astronomical position at any point, where you are relative to the rising sun. Which direction the midsummer solstice lies, where north is, and east, and all the other cardinal and intercardinal points. This is mapping, not cartographic mapping in the sense of a drawn representation of the landscape. Practical spatial mapping, embedded in the landscape itself, using the monuments as a reference system. The people who lived and worked in this landscape did not need a map drawn on parchment. They were living in the map. Every monument they looked at told them something about where they were and how the landscape was oriented relative to the sky. And the cursus, that long, mysterious earthwork that has puzzled archaeologists for so long, may fit into this system too. At sunrise on certain days of the year, particularly around the equinoxes, the orientation of the cursus creates a sightline that connects specific features of the landscape with the rising sun. The cursus may be a horizon marker, a deliberate landscape modification that enhances the visibility of astronomical events from the surrounding area. Or it may be a processional route, a deliberately marked path through the landscape along which people moved during solstice and equinox gatherings. Walking a known path in a known direction at a known time of year is itself a way of experiencing astronomical knowledge physically, your body moving through the landscape in alignment with the sky. This is not worship. This is, in a sense, the experience of being inside the instrument, of being part of the machine that measures time. And that experience, the physical embodiment of astronomical knowledge, is something that the builders of stone circles clearly valued, given the enormous effort they expended on creating environments in which it could happen. The great stone circles were not just observation platforms, they were experiences. They were designed to make the knowledge of the sky palpable, physical, present. You stood at the center of the circle at the midsummer sunrise and felt the first light of the solstice dawn hitting you full in the face through the carefully aligned gap between the carefully placed stones. In that moment, you were not just observing an astronomical event, you were inside it. The monument was connecting your body, your physical presence, to the movement of the sky. That is extraordinary. And it is a kind of knowledge transmission that no book can replicate. The knowledge of the solstice that lives in your body, felt rather than merely understood, is a different kind of knowledge from the astronomical fact stated in a text. It is deeper, it is more persistent, it is more likely to be passed on, because you will want to give your children the same experience you had. The monuments were creating embodied knowledge. They were not just encoding information in stone, they were creating experiences that encoded information in people. This is why, even after the explicit astronomical knowledge had been lost, even after nobody could tell you anymore why the sun rose through that particular gap between those particular stones on that particular morning, the gatherings at the stone circles continued. The experience persisted even when the explanation for it had faded. The feeling of standing in the right place at the right time, with the rising sun touching your face and the ancient stones framing the horizon around you, that feeling was worth preserving even without the theory. The ritual is the fossil of the knowledge. It preserves the form of the experience, even when the content has been forgotten. And that is why, 4,000 years later, people are still gathering at Stonehenge for the midsummer sunrise. Not because they understand what Stonehenge was built for, at least not most of them, but because the monument is still doing something to them, something they cannot quite explain, something that feels important. They are experiencing what the builders intended them to experience. And they are right to value that experience, even if they are wrong about what it means. The meaning, the real meaning, is older and stranger and more practical and more beautiful than anything the ritual has preserved. The meaning is that these extraordinary people, living at the far northwestern edge of the known world, in a climate that was cold and unpredictable and often brutal, looked at the sky and decided to understand it, committed to understanding it, organized their entire civilization around the project of understanding it, built monuments of stone that would preserve their understanding for millennia after they were gone, and then, largely, they were forgotten. Their names were lost. Their language was lost. Their knowledge was lost, or most of it. The monuments remained, pointing at the sky, waiting, and we are only now, slowly, beginning to understand what they were pointing at. That is the real reason Britain has so many stone circles. Not religion, not worship, not the desire to commune with inscrutable gods, the desire to know, the determination to understand, the long, hard, generations-spanning work of observing the sky and recording what you see and building something permanent to preserve what you have learned. The circles are not temples, they are libraries, written in stone, oriented to the sky, still readable to anyone who takes the time to learn the language. We have a different language now for the things they knew. We call it astronomy, and physics, and calendar science, and navigation, and meteorology. We have written it down, encoded it in computers, taught it in universities. We think we are far beyond what those stone circle builders understood. In terms of the quantity and precision of our astronomical knowledge, we undoubtedly are. The builders of Stonehenge knew nothing about the physics of stellar fusion, or the scale of the universe, or the mechanics of orbital motion. But in terms of the quality of their relationship to the sky, in terms of the directness and immediacy and embodied quality of their astronomical understanding, we have lost something that they had. They looked at the sky and saw a system they were part of. We look at the sky through telescopes and mathematical models and see something immeasurably vast and essentially foreign. They built their world around the sky, literally. They encoded the sky in their landscape. They made the sky present in every community, permanently, through the monuments they raised. We have outsourced that relationship to institutions, to scientists and meteorologists and the weather apps on our phones. The sky is something that experts deal with on our behalf. We consult the data. We no longer watch. The stone circles are an invitation to watch again, to stand in the right place at the right time and look at where the sun rises and feel the connection that the builders intended, not as worship, as observation, as participation in the great, slow, regular, reliable cycles of a universe that is paying no attention to us, but that nevertheless, if we pay attention to it, tells us everything we need to know. The stones are still there, the sky is still there, and the answer, if you want to know it, has been pointing at you for 5,000 years. You only have to look. There is one more thing I want to tell you about stone circles, and it is perhaps the most unexpected thing in this entire account, something that archaeologists have only recently begun to take seriously, despite the evidence for it being present in the landscape for a very long time. The stone circles, or at least some of them, are geologically deliberate. What I mean by that is this. The stones used in stone circles were not always chosen purely for their size, their durability, or their proximity to the building site. There is growing evidence that specific types of stone were selected for specific types of circles, and that the selection criteria included the geological properties of the stone itself. We have already talked about the acoustic properties of the Priestley bluestone used at Stonehenge, but there are other geological properties that appear to have been important to the builders. Several stone circles in Britain are built entirely or partly from stones that have a property called piezoelectricity. Piezoelectric materials generate a small electrical charge when they are subjected to mechanical stress, such as pressure or vibration. The effect in natural stone is tiny, barely measurable, and it is not clear that the builders of the stone circles knew about it in any explicit physical sense. But it is interesting that so many stone circles use rocks, particularly granite and quartzite, that exhibit this property. Dowsers and earth mystery researchers have been claiming for decades that stone circles sit on or near geological fault lines and underground water sources, and that these locations generate unusual electromagnetic or geomagnetic fields. The mainstream archaeological community has generally dismissed these claims as pseudoscience. But recent geological surveys at several stone circle sites, using the same kinds of non-invasive instruments that revealed the post holes at Stanton Drew, have found evidence of unusual geomagnetic properties at some sites. Not dramatic fields, not anything that would register on ordinary measurement equipment or be perceptible to ordinary human senses, but subtle anomalies in the local geomagnetic background that correlate with the placement of the circles. Is this significant? We genuinely do not know. The data are too sparse. The methodology of this kind of research is still being developed, and the claims being made on the basis of the evidence are often far ahead of what the evidence actually supports. But it raises a question that we would be premature to dismiss entirely. If the builders of stone circles were observing the natural world with the kind of careful, sustained attention that we have been crediting them with throughout this account, is it completely impossible that they noticed, over generations of use of particular sites, that certain locations felt different, that certain stones responded differently to drumming or singing, that certain places in the landscape had properties, subtle and hard to articulate, that made them feel significant? The human nervous system is an extraordinarily sensitive instrument. It can detect variations in temperature, humidity, air pressure, sound frequency, and many other physical parameters that are too small for us to consciously identify, but that nevertheless influence our sense of a place. A site with unusual acoustic properties might feel different from a site without them. A site on a geological fault might have subtle ground vibration patterns that feel different underfoot. If the knowledge keepers who selected sites for stone circles were paying close attention to these subtle differences, as part of their general practice of careful environmental observation, they might have selected sites for reasons that included sensory properties that we have not yet learned to measure or verify. This is speculative. I want to be clear about that. The acoustic properties are documented and measurable. The geomagnetic properties are suggestive, but still uncertain. The more exotic sensory properties being claimed in some quarters have no scientific validation at all. But the principle, The idea that the builders of stone circles were paying close attention to all the properties of their sites, including properties that are subtle and not immediately obvious, is entirely consistent with everything else we know about their practice. They were, above all, observant, and careful observation, sustained over many generations, can detect patterns that single-generation analysis misses entirely. The stone circles may be pointing at things we cannot yet see, and that is worth taking seriously. Let me come back to the big picture now. To step back from the specific sites and the specific alignments and the specific geological properties and look at the whole pattern from a distance. Britain, in the Neolithic and Bronze Age, was a landscape that had been settled, managed, and modified by human communities for thousands of years. These communities were not passive inhabitants of a natural landscape. They were active agents who transformed their environment, cleared forests, managed grazing, drained wetlands, built roads and causeways and earthworks on a landscape scale. The stone circles were part of that transformation. They were not exotic intrusions into a natural landscape. They were elements of a managed, humanized landscape, built by communities who understood their environment in extraordinary detail and who modified it deliberately to serve their needs. And the network of stone circles was the communication and knowledge infrastructure of that managed landscape. It was the system that allowed farming communities spread across thousands of kilometers to coordinate their activities, share their astronomical observations, maintain consistent calendars, navigate the seas and rivers, and transmit the accumulated knowledge of generations forward in time. Remove the stone circles from the landscape, and you remove the infrastructure that made coordinated agriculture across the British Isles possible. You remove the tide tables, and the solstice markers, and the navigation waypoints, and the acoustic teaching halls, and the knowledge repository that kept everything running. The stone circles were, in the most literal sense, the internet of their day. A distributed network of information nodes, connected by human messengers and seasonal gatherings, maintaining the flow of critical knowledge across a vast territory. Unlike the internet, the network was more valuable than any single node. The Ring of Brodgar, by itself, was useful. The Ring of Brodgar, in communication with Callanish and Stonehenge and the Long Meg and her daughters and all the other major sites, was transformatively powerful. That is the final and most important thing I want you to take away from this account. The stone circles are not individual monuments. They are a network, and networks are more than the sum of their parts. The brilliance of the Neolithic builders was not just that they built individual structures of remarkable precision and ambition. It was that they connected those structures into a system that could do things that individual circles could not do alone, a system that distributed knowledge across a landscape, making it more robust to local failure, more accessible to more communities, more durable against the attrition of time. We have networks too, of course. We have global communication networks of staggering complexity and capability, but we did not inherit them from the Neolithic world, any more than we inherited our writing from people who never had it. What we did inherit, embedded so deeply in our landscape that we stopped seeing it, is the evidence that the impulse to build networks, to connect knowledge nodes, to create shared information infrastructure across a wide territory, is ancient, is older than civilization, as we usually define it, is perhaps one of the things that made civilization possible in the first place. The stone circles were not the result of civilization, they were among its causes. They made possible a level of coordination, a level of shared knowledge, a level of collective capability that transformed a landscape of scattered farming communities into something coherent enough to build Stonehenge. Something coherent enough to move 250-kilometer consignments of stone across the sea and the land. Something coherent enough to maintain a knowledge tradition for 1,000 years and then build permanent monuments to preserve it for thousands more. We did not give those people credit for this. For a long time, we barely gave them credit for being human in the full sense. They were primitive, we said. They were superstitious. They were simple folk, doing simple things that happened to leave impressive remnants. The stones say otherwise. The stones say, these were people of extraordinary intelligence, extraordinary organization, extraordinary foresight, people who thought about the future in terms of centuries and built for it accordingly. People who understood that knowledge is the most valuable resource a community can have, and who built their civilization around the project of preserving and transmitting it. They deserve better than the story we have been telling about them. And the story they left behind, encoded in stone and aligned to the sky, is waiting for us to read it properly. The circles are still there. The sky is still turning. The alignments still work. What happened at these places, 5,000 years ago, was not a mystery in the sense of something unknowable. It was a mystery in the sense of something not yet fully known. And the not yet fully known is a category that should fill us with curiosity, not reverence, with questions, not silence. The right response to the stone circles is not to stand at a respectful distance and feel the weight of ancient mystery. The right response is to walk up to them, measure them, calculate their alignments, listen to their acoustics, survey the ground beneath them, and ask, what were you for? Because the answer, when it comes, is going to be better than anything you were told in school. It is going to be smarter, and more practical, and more human, and more moving than the old story of primitive people worshipping inscrutable gods under the British sky. The real story is one of people looking at the sky and understanding it, building tools to understand it better, preserving that understanding in stone for the people who would come after them, creating, in the process, one of the most remarkable intellectual and organizational achievements in the history of our species. That is the real reason Britain has so many stone circles. And it is, I think, a story worth knowing. Let me tell you about a moment that happened in the summer of 2021, because it captures something about the state of our understanding of these monuments that I find both humbling and encouraging. A team of archaeologists from the University of Southampton were conducting a routine survey of a field in Wiltshire using ground-penetrating radar to map the subsurface features of an area they suspected might contain Neolithic remains. They were not near Stonehenge. They were not near any famous site. They were in a quiet agricultural landscape that had been farmed continuously for millennia, and their expectations were modest. What they found was not modest. Beneath the field, at a depth of about a meter, there was a circle, a perfect circle, roughly 100 meters in diameter, defined by a pattern of subsurface features that the radar was picking up as anomalies in the soil. The features appeared to be pits, perhaps 60 of them, arranged with a regularity that could only be the result of deliberate design. Dating the discovery proved difficult, as it always does with subsurface features that have not been excavated. But the characteristics of the pits, their depth, their spacing, their fill, suggested they were Neolithic or early Bronze Age in date, roughly contemporary with Stonehenge, or perhaps earlier. This is the part that matters. This discovery was entirely accidental. Nobody had suspected that this circle was here. The ground above it showed no visible features, no crop marks, nothing that would have drawn attention to it. It had been there, hidden under a ploughed field, for thousands of years, invisible to everyone who had walked above it. And here is the thing. This is not a unique discovery. In recent years, the application of remote sensing technologies to the British landscape has revealed dozens of previously unknown stone and timber circles, earthworks, monuments, and settlement sites, all invisible from the surface, all lying beneath fields and farms and parks and roads that have been in continuous use for centuries. We do not know how many stone circles there are in Britain. We know how many we have found and recorded, but the number we have found may be only a fraction of the number that actually exist, either still standing or buried or robbed out for building material in the medieval period. The network was larger than we think. The density of knowledge infrastructure across the Neolithic landscape was greater than our current picture suggests. And as the survey technology improves, and as more of the landscape is covered, the map is going to get more crowded. Every newly discovered circle is another data point, another node in the network, another piece of evidence that this was not a scattered tradition of local monument building, but a connected, coherent, landscape-scale system of unprecedented ambition. Britain in the Neolithic period was, in some respects, that we are only beginning to appreciate, more organized than we thought, more connected, more capable, more knowledgeable. The stone circles are not the traces of a primitive culture. They are the traces of a sophisticated one, a culture sophisticated in ways that are different from our own, using different technologies and different organizational forms, but addressing the same fundamental challenge that every civilization has faced. The challenge of knowing enough to survive, and knowing enough to make the future better than the past. They met that challenge remarkably well, and the stones they raised to meet it are still standing, still pointing at the sky, still waiting for us to ask them the question they were built to answer. What time is it? And by that, I mean, not what hour of the day. But where are we in the great cycles of the sky and the earth and the living world? What season is coming? What tides will rise? What floods will come? What harvests await? The stone circles were built to answer those questions. They were built so that everyone, in every generation, could have access to the knowledge needed to answer those questions. They were built so that no community would have to face the future without the tools to understand it. That is not religion. That is not mystery. That is not the inscrutable spiritual yearning of primitive minds. That is civilization. At its best, at its most generous, at its most far-sighted. And it is all around you, if you know where to look. The circles are still there. Go find them. Look up and listen. The sky is still talking. There is a place in Perthshire, in central Scotland, called Croft Morag. It sits on a slight rise above the River Tay, surrounded by farmland that has been worked for so many centuries that the original landscape the monument was built into has become almost impossible to reconstruct. The monument itself is modest. A small stone circle, oval rather than circular, with a group of outlying stones set a short distance beyond the main ring. Most people who visit it come away slightly disappointed. It is not dramatically imposing. It does not announce itself with the kind of visual authority that Stonehenge commands from a distance of several kilometers, but Croft Morag has something that most stone circles lack. It has been excavated carefully, with attention to both the physical evidence of construction and the stratigraphic record of use over time. And what the excavations revealed is a sequence of occupation that is extraordinary in its implications. The site was in use for roughly 3,000 years. 3,000 years. From around 3000 BCE to somewhere around 1500 BCE or later. That is not a single monument built at a single moment. That is a site that was continuously used, periodically modified, and persistently maintained for a period longer than from the fall of Rome to the present day. In the earliest phase, there were timber posts arranged in a horseshoe shape. Later, the timber was replaced by stone, a low setting of stones forming a roughly oval arrangement. Later still, taller stones were added to the existing setting, increasing its visual impact and potentially modifying its alignments. In the final phase, a separate ring of standing stones was erected around the central setting, creating the monument visible today. Each phase represents a community decision to invest resources in a site that already existed, not to abandon the old monument and build something new elsewhere. To come back to the same place, again and again, and build on what was there, to add to the record, to deepen the investment. Why? Why keep coming back to the same place, century after century? The most convincing answer is the one we have been developing throughout this account. Because the site worked. Because the alignments encoded in the monument were accurate, and generations of experience had confirmed their accuracy. Because the knowledge that the site preserved was genuine, verified, reliable knowledge that communities in the region depended on for their agricultural decisions, their navigation, their understanding of the cycles that governed their lives. You come back to the tool that works. You maintain the instrument that gives you reliable results. You invest in the infrastructure that has proven its value through long use. 3,000 years of investment at a single site is not the behavior of a community performing empty ritual. It is the behavior of a community that knows the ritual is working, even if later generations may have forgotten exactly why. The monument accumulates the generations. Each modification adds the contribution of another era of observation, another set of people who checked the alignments, confirmed they were still accurate, added their own refinements, and passed the site on to their successors with all their additions preserved. Croft Morag is not just a monument, it is a document. A physical record of 3,000 years of accumulated astronomical observation, encoded in stone, readable to anyone who knows the language. We do not yet fully know the language, but we are learning. Let me turn to a dimension of the stone circle tradition that I have been circling around throughout this account, approaching from different directions but not yet addressing directly. The question of gender. Who were the knowledge keepers? When we imagine the specialists who designed and maintained the stone circle network, who do we see? The default image, shaped by centuries of cultural assumption and reinforced by the Druid mythology that has attached itself to these sites, is male. Elderly male priests, robed and bearded, conducting mysterious ceremonies. The high priests of a sun cult, the patriarchal guardians of astronomical knowledge. But there is good reason to question this assumption, and the reason comes from the archaeology. The material culture of Neolithic Britain, the objects that people made and used and left behind, does not support a picture of dramatically gendered division of labor in most domains. The pottery that was produced in Neolithic communities, which was one of the major technological innovations of the period, shows no consistent evidence of being made exclusively by men or exclusively by women. The same is true for the production of flint tools, the weaving of plant fiber textiles, and the construction of domestic buildings. More importantly, the skeletal evidence from excavated burial sites shows that women in Neolithic Britain were physically robust, with bone structure and muscle attachment patterns that indicate heavy labor. They were not being sheltered from physical work. They were doing it in roughly equal measure to men. And the isotopic evidence from bones, which can tell you something about where a person grew up and what they ate, shows that in many Neolithic communities, it was women rather than men who moved between communities at marriage. The men stayed home, the women traveled. This is the opposite of the pattern that most modern people instinctively assume. It is also, importantly, a pattern that would have had significant consequences for the transmission of specialized knowledge. If women were the ones moving between communities, then women were the ones carrying knowledge across the landscape. Women who traveled from one community to another, who maintained networks of personal connection across wide territories, would have been natural conduits for the transmission of astronomical knowledge, construction techniques, and the other specialist information encoded in the stone circle tradition. The knowledge keepers of the stone circle tradition may have been women, not exclusively, certainly, but the assumption that they were primarily male deserves to be challenged, and the archaeological evidence provides significant grounds for challenging it. Some researchers have gone further, noting that several stone circle traditions across Britain appear to have astronomical alignments that correlate with phenomena that have traditionally been associated with women in agricultural societies, lunar cycles, the connection between the moon and female reproductive rhythms, the tidal patterns that affect the gathering of shellfish, which was typically women's work in most foraging societies. This is speculative, but it is speculative in a productive direction. It invites us to question the assumptions we bring to these sites and to consider whether the specialists who built and maintained them looked different from the specialists we habitually imagine. The stone circles were, among other things, records of careful observation over long periods. The observers who built up those records over centuries were members of communities. They were embedded in social structures and gender arrangements that we can partially but not fully reconstruct. The knowledge they preserved was the product of many minds, including minds that we have historically tended to overlook. To understand the stone circles fully, we need to take seriously the full range of people who might have built and used them, not just the imagined male priests. The grandmothers who remembered the previous lunar standstill, the young women who traveled between communities and carried knowledge in their heads across hundreds of kilometers, the midwives who understood the lunar connections to human birth cycles, the fisherwomen who knew the tides. These were part of the community of knowledge that the circles encoded. And their contribution, largely invisible to us now, was real. Now, let me tell you about something that happened in the 1990s that transformed our understanding of what the landscape around Stonehenge actually looked like at the height of its use. Aerial photography of Britain began in earnest in the First World War, and the decades since have produced an enormous archive of images taken at different times of year and in different lighting conditions. In certain conditions, particularly in dry summers when the ground is parched, features that are invisible at ground level become apparent from the air. Buried ditches and post holes retain moisture better than the surrounding soil, and in a drought year, the grass above them stays greener while the rest turns brown. The result is that the hidden subsurface features appear as dark marks, crop marks, against the parched landscape. Over decades of aerial survey, the landscape around Stonehenge accumulated an enormous number of crop mark features, hundreds of them, representing buried monuments of many different types and periods. But the truly transformative development came in the early 2010s, when a project called the Stonehenge Hidden Landscapes Project used a combination of ground-penetrating radar, magnetometry, and other remote sensing techniques to survey an area of roughly 12 square kilometers around Stonehenge in unprecedented detail. The results, published in 2014, revealed something that nobody had expected. The landscape around Stonehenge was not the relatively simple sacred landscape that had been assumed. It was extraordinarily complex. Hundreds of previously unknown features were mapped, including new monuments, new earthworks, new evidence of settlement and activity that completely rewrote the picture of what was happening in this landscape during the Neolithic and Bronze Age. Most strikingly, the survey revealed a previously unknown row of massive stones buried just beneath the surface near the monument known as Durrington Walls. 90 stones or more, each originally standing several meters tall, arranged in a C shape that enclosed the southern end of the Durrington enclosure. These were not small stones. They were comparable in size to some of the Stonehenge sarsens, and they had been buried, deliberately toppled and pushed down into the ground, probably around 2500 BCE, at roughly the time when Stonehenge was reaching its most complex phase of construction. Why would you bury 90 massive standing stones? What reason could there be for the deliberate destruction of a monument on that scale? One possibility is that the buried stones represented an earlier phase of the knowledge network, a set of alignments or reference points that were being superseded by the more sophisticated Stonehenge complex. When Stonehenge reached its full complexity, perhaps the older system in the Durrington area was no longer needed, and it was decommissioned. The stones were toppled and buried, perhaps with ceremony, perhaps simply for practical reasons, clearing the site for new uses. This would be consistent with the picture of the stone circle tradition as a knowledge system rather than a religious tradition. Knowledge systems get updated. When a better instrument supersedes an older one, the older instrument can be retired. Religious traditions do not work the same way. Sacred monuments are not easily destroyed or buried simply because a better sacred monument has been constructed nearby. The buried stones at Durrington Walls look like decommissioned infrastructure, like old servers taken out of service when a more powerful system comes online. And if that is what they are, then they tell us something important about how the knowledge network of Neolithic Wiltshire was managed. It was managed actively. Decisions were made about what to keep and what to retire. Resources were allocated to specific sites at the expense of others. The system was maintained, modified, updated. This is the behavior of an institution, not of a religion. Institutions make rational decisions about their infrastructure. They upgrade what works and retire what has been superseded. Religions preserve the old because it is sacred, regardless of whether it is still functional. The Durrington buried stones are evidence of rational infrastructure management, of a knowledge system being actively developed and improved, not simply preserved out of reverence. Let me bring us now to the very end of the stone circle tradition, the period between roughly 1500 and 1000 BCE when construction ceased, and the monuments began their long transition from living infrastructure to mysterious ruins. Because understanding how the tradition ended tells us something important about what it had been. The evidence from this period is complex and sometimes contradictory. In some regions, stone circles continued to be maintained and apparently used long after construction had stopped elsewhere. In other regions, they appear to have been abandoned abruptly, with no evidence of continued activity. Some circles show signs of deliberate damage, stones pushed over or removed, that might indicate hostility toward the monument tradition rather than simply neglect. The period coincides with significant climate deterioration across northwestern Europe. Temperatures dropped, rainfall increased, and the upland areas where many stone circles had been built became increasingly inhospitable to agriculture. Communities that had farmed the moorland edges for generations found themselves retreating to lower ground abandoning the landscapes where the circles stood. An observatory on a windswept moor is only useful if you can get to it regularly. If the moorland becomes too wet, too cold, too far from where people are living to be visited consistently, it stops being maintained. The sightlines become overgrown, the stones shift, the knowledge of how to read the alignments begins to fade. The climate change of the mid-Bronze Age may have cut the stone circle network off from the communities that had maintained it, simply by making the relevant landscapes inaccessible. Not all at once, not completely, but gradually, over generations, as the marginal areas that had supported the most intensive monument-building activity became less hospitable. This is a deeply mundane explanation for the end of one of the most remarkable intellectual traditions in human history. No dramatic collapse, no conquering invaders, no religious revolution. Just the slow degradation of access, the gradual loss of the specialists who could no longer reach the sites they were supposed to maintain, the knowledge that survived in memory for a generation or two after the monuments themselves fell into disuse and then faded. The climate ate the stone circles, not the stones themselves, which are still there, but the network, the living system, the ongoing practice of observation and record and transmission that had kept the circles working for 1,000 years. And when the climate moderated again, in the centuries around 1000 BCE and after, the communities that came back to the landscape found the circles still standing but no longer understood. The stones were there. The knowledge of what they were for had gone. From that point on, the stone circles were mysteries. Impressive, durable, undeniable mysteries, but mysteries nonetheless. And the stories that people told about them, to explain their presence, the stories about giants and wizards and gods and heroes, were not lies or deliberate obscurantism. They were the genuine attempts of intelligent people to make sense of things they did not understand, using the cultural vocabulary available to them. The giants who built the circles were the imaginative echo of the extraordinary communities that actually did it. The wizards and priests who supposedly directed the work were the distorted memory of the real knowledge keepers who designed the alignments. The gods being worshipped at the circles were the sky phenomena that the circles had originally been built to track. Memory does not disappear cleanly. It transforms. It finds new containers. The knowledge that was once precise and functional becomes symbolic and mythological. The astronomical facts become stories about divine beings. The agricultural calendar becomes the religious year. The observatory becomes the temple. And then, thousands of years later, someone comes along and reads the stories and says, these must have been places of worship. Of course. We made the same mistake that the storytellers made, in reverse. They took the practical and made it mythological. We took the mythological and decided it was the only story there was. Both were wrong. Both were doing the best they could with what they had. We have more tools now. We have surveying instruments and remote sensing technology and astronomical software and genetic analysis and isotopic dating. We have the ability to look at these monuments with a precision that no previous generation possessed. And what we find, when we look with that precision, is not simply religion, not simply mystery, not simply primitive spiritual yearning. We find engineering, we find astronomy, we find knowledge management, we find a civilization addressing real problems with real solutions, built to last real centuries. We find intelligence, organized, persistent, ambitious, generous intelligence, reaching forward across millennia to give us tools we forgot we had inherited. The stone circles are there. They have been there. They will be there, most of them, long after we are gone. They are patient. They can wait. They have been waiting for this long already. Long Meg and her daughters is a stone circle in Cumbria, in the northwest of England, not far from the Lake District. It is the sixth largest stone circle in Britain, a roughly oval arrangement of around 69 stones, enclosing an area of roughly 110 meters by 90 meters. The circle is named after the largest outlying stone, Long Meg herself, a 4-meter-tall red sandstone pillar that stands outside the main circle to the southwest. The name is medieval. Long Meg was, according to local tradition, a witch who was turned to stone along with her daughters by a Scottish wizard called Michael Scott. The daughters, naturally, are the stones of the inner circle. But Long Meg has something that most legendary witch stones do not have. She has carvings on her surface, cup and ring marks, spirals, and other geometric designs carved into the stone surface at some point during the monument's history, possibly during its construction or shortly after. Cup and ring marks appear on stones across Britain and Ireland, and they are one of the most discussed and least understood elements of the prehistoric art tradition. They consist of a central circular hollow, the cup, surrounded by one or more concentric rings, the rings, sometimes with a groove running outward from the cup through the rings, creating a keyhole-like pattern. They appear on standing stones, on rock faces, on the interior surfaces of chambered tombs. What do they mean? Nobody knows with certainty. But several researchers have noted that cup and ring marks have a specific astronomical dimension. When viewed from certain angles in certain light conditions, the pattern of cup and ring marks can function as a kind of map of astronomical phenomena. The cup represents a central point. The rings represent the orbits of celestial bodies around it. The groove represents the direction of a key alignment. This is speculative, but it is consistent with the context. Cup and ring marks appear disproportionately, often on stones that are already astronomically significant, on outliers and entrance stones at stone circles, on the entrance stones of chambered tombs whose passages are aligned to specific astronomical events. If they are astronomical notation, they are recording something about what the relevant stone is marking. Long Meg herself, positioned to the southwest of her daughters and carved with these marks, may be an annotated navigational marker, a stone that says, both here is the southwestern alignment, and here is how to read it. This is a remarkable idea. Not marks made for decoration or for spiritual purposes, but marks made for information. Instructions. A notation system for astronomical alignments carved onto the relevant stones so that the knowledge of their function is preserved in the most direct possible way. We cannot read this notation system. We do not yet understand the convention for translating the cups and rings into astronomical information, but the possibility that they encode such information is real, and it is supported by the distribution and context of the marks. If we ever do learn to read them, we may find that the builders of the stone circles left us not just the monuments themselves, but a set of instructions for how to use them. A user manual, carved in stone, waiting to be decoded. The stones are still talking. We just have not yet figured out what they are saying. There is another class of stone monuments in Britain that relates to the stone circles in ways that are only beginning to be understood. These are the stone rows, long lines of standing stones, sometimes just a single row of stones stretching for hundreds of meters, sometimes multiple parallel rows running side by side for kilometers. Dartmoor in Devon has the greatest concentration of stone rows in Britain. There are more than 70 of them on the moor, ranging from short single rows of just a few stones to the remarkable double row at Merivale, which runs for roughly 200 meters and is aligned to the midsummer sunrise. The stone rows were built at roughly the same period as the stone circles, in the late Neolithic and early Bronze Age, and many of them terminate at, or are associated with stone circles or burial cairns. They appear to be connecting the landscape, drawing lines between significant points, creating paths of alignment that link one monument to another. What were they for? The standard interpretation is processional routes, paths along which ritual processions moved during ceremonies, and that may be part of the answer. But the alignments of the rows to astronomical phenomena suggest something more precise. They are not just any paths. They are specifically oriented paths, pointing in specific directions that correspond to specific astronomical events. A stone row aligned to the midsummer sunrise is not just a path, it is a foresight. Standing at one end of the row and looking along its length, you are looking in the direction of the midsummer sunrise. The row tells you where east at midsummer is. It is a direction indicator, permanently marked in the landscape. Multiple stone rows, pointing in different directions, from different start points across the same landscape, create a complex network of directional references. An observer who knows the rows can use them as a coordinate system, locating themselves in astronomical space by checking which rows they can see and what direction they point. Dartmoor, with its 70 stone rows, is a landscape saturated with directional information. Every time you look across the moor, you are seeing astronomical alignments marked in stone. Every walk across the landscape is a walk through a coordinate system. This is what we would now call spatial infrastructure. It is the equivalent of a coordinate grid imposed on a landscape, making it navigable and comprehensible to everyone who knows how to read it. Dartmoor in the Bronze Age was one of the most intensively farmed landscapes in Britain. The extensive systems of field boundaries, called reeves, that can still be seen on the moor represent a sophisticated, planned agricultural landscape, organized on a large scale with considerable precision. The stone rows were part of the same planned landscape, providing the astronomical reference system that allowed the field layout to be coordinated with the agricultural calendar. You need to know when the growing season starts in your specific location, at your specific altitude. The field boundaries tell you where to plant. The stone rows tell you when. Together, they represent a complete agricultural management system embedded permanently in the landscape. This is not primitive. This is not simple. This is not religion. This is civilization. And it was here, on Dartmoor, in the southwest of England, 4,000 years ago, before the Romans came, before the Saxons came, before anyone from the Mediterranean world had any idea that these islands existed or that the people on them were doing anything worth recording. They were doing something extraordinary. And they left the evidence of it in the stone, where it waited, for 4,000 years, for someone to look carefully enough to understand what they were seeing. We are, slowly, getting there. There is a story I want to tell you about a shepherd in the Outer Hebrides. Not a real shepherd, not a historical figure, but a composite of the kind of knowledge that ordinary people in these communities must have possessed. This shepherd lives on the Isle of Lewis, within walking distance of the Callanish stones. She has known the stones all her life. Her grandmother showed them to her when she was a child, and her grandmother's grandmother showed her grandmother, and back for how many generations she cannot say. She does not know, in any formal sense, what the Callanish stones are. She does not know about the major lunar standstill. She does not know about the 18-and-a-half-year cycle. The language in which those things were once understood, the technical vocabulary, and the mathematical framework, that is gone. It has been gone for a long time. But she knows something else. She knows that every autumn, when the hills across Loch Roge take on a certain colour and the light comes from a certain angle, the nights get longer faster than at other times of year. She knows that the fish run differently in the weeks around that change. She knows that the tides are higher in the mornings for a few weeks around that time, and that the best clams are found on the rocks that are only exposed at the lowest tides. She knows these things because she watched them, because her grandmother watched them, because watching and remembering and teaching what you remember is what her people have always done. She cannot tell you why the tides are higher then, or why the fish run changes, or why the light comes from that angle. The why is lost, but the what and the when, and what it means for tomorrow and next week, the what is still there. Preserved not in stone now, but in the accumulated knowledge of a family, a community, a tradition of careful watching that has never entirely ceased. The knowledge keepers of the Callanish tradition built their understanding in stone because they understood that individual memory is fallible, that communities get disrupted, that the chain of teaching can be broken. They encoded the knowledge in the most permanent medium they could find, so that even if the chain was broken, the information would still be there. The chain was broken. The formal understanding of what the stones were for was lost. But something persisted, at a lower fidelity, in the practices and observations of people who lived near the stones, who watched the same sky and the same sea that the builders had watched, who continued to accumulate practical knowledge even as the theoretical framework that had once organized it faded away. The shepherd's grandmother knew that the spring tides come higher in autumn. She did not know why, but she knew it reliably, because it was true, because the pattern was real, because the observation that the Callanish builders had encoded in stone was still observable to anyone who paid attention. The knowledge never entirely disappeared. It just lost its theory. The practice persisted without the explanation, and slowly, as the archaeoastronomers survey the stones, and the geologists study the landscape and the historians piece together the fragments, the explanation is coming back. The theory is reconnecting with the practice. The why is being rebuilt around the what that was never entirely lost. The stones did their job, not perfectly, not without loss, but better than anything else could have done. The knowledge they encoded survived, in some form, for long enough that we can now begin to reconstruct it. That is the measure of their success. That 4,000 years later, we are still here, still watching the same sky, still learning from the same horizon, because of the stones, because someone built them to last, because a community of remarkable people, 4,000 years ago, decided that the knowledge they had accumulated was worth preserving for people they would never meet, in a future they could not imagine. They were right. It was worth preserving, and we are the beneficiaries of their foresight. The stone circles are still there, and the sky is still there, and the knowledge, slowly, is coming back. One alignment at a time, one measurement at a time, one careful observation at a time, just as it was accumulated in the first place. That is how knowledge works when it is working well. Slowly, patiently, carefully, building one piece on another until the picture emerges from the accumulation of detail. The builders of the stone circles understood that. They were patient enough to observe the sky for generations before they built a single stone. They were careful enough to measure with precision and build with accuracy. They were wise enough to encode their knowledge in a medium that would outlast everything else about them. Their names are gone. Their language is gone. Their social structures and their stories and their daily lives are gone, but the knowledge is still there, in the stones, pointing at the sky, waiting. We are learning to read it, and when we do, we will find that what we thought was mystery was actually clarity. What we thought was religion was actually science. What we thought was the past is actually a message, addressed to us, from people who understood, 4,000 years ago, that the future would need to know what they had learned. They were right. We do need to know. The circles are there to teach us. All we have to do is look up and listen. The sky is still talking, the same as it always was, and the stones are still pointing at the right part of it. What time is it? Look at the stones. They will tell you. They always have. They always will. There is something I have not yet told you about the stone circles that I think is the most quietly extraordinary thing about them, and it is something that the standard archaeological narrative almost never mentions. The builders were working without maps, not without knowledge of the landscape, not without the ability to navigate across it. They knew the landscape intimately, in the way that only people who have lived in a place for generations can know it. They knew where the rivers ran and where they flooded. They knew which passes through the hills were traversable in winter and which were not. They knew where the oak groves were and where the best flint outcropped from the chalk. But they did not have a drawn map, not as far as we know. No aerial photograph, no satellite image, no schematic representation of the landscape that would let them see, from a distance, how all the parts fitted together. And yet they built a network of monuments whose overall distribution, when you see it from a satellite image or a modern survey map, makes sense as a network. The spacing is not random. The clustering is not accidental. The coverage of the landscape reflects something like a plan, a systematic intention to place nodes at intervals that would make the network functional across the entire territory. How did they achieve that without maps? The answer, if we are right about the sophistication of these builders, is that they did not need drawn maps. They had something better. They had a living, accumulating, oral geographical database that resided in the collective memory of the specialist knowledge keepers. A detailed mental map of the landscape, built up over generations, maintained and updated by people who traveled it regularly, that allowed them to make rational decisions about where to place new monuments. When a community decided to build a new stone circle, they would have consulted the network. They would have asked the traveling knowledge keepers, the people who moved between communities maintaining and transmitting the tradition, where the gaps were. Where in the landscape was there no monument within practical travel distance? Where were the sight lines between existing monuments blocked by topography? Where would a new node add most to the network? Those decisions would have been made by people who held the entire network in their heads. Who knew, from personal travel and from the accumulated knowledge of their predecessors, where every circle was, what it aligned to, how far it was from its nearest neighbors, what communities it served. The network was designed by people who were, in effect, walking databases of geographical and astronomical information. And when those people were gone, When the chain of transmission was broken, not only was the astronomical knowledge lost, the geographical knowledge was lost too. The understanding of how the circles related to each other, of how the network as a whole functioned, went with the knowledge keepers when they died. We are rebuilding it now, piece by piece, from satellite images and ground surveys and computer models. We are reconstructing the map that they held in their heads, and as the map takes shape, the network becomes visible. It is, when you see it, one of the most extraordinary things a human civilization has ever achieved. A landscape-scale information system, built in the most durable available medium, maintained for 1,000 years by a tradition of specialists who gave everything to its preservation, and then left standing as a message to the future when that tradition finally failed. The message says, approximately, this: we were here. We watched the sky. We understood what it was telling us. We built these markers so you would know what we knew when we were gone. We left them for you. We hope you are asking the right questions. We think you might be, finally, starting to keep looking. There is one more stone circle I want to visit with you before we come to rest, and it is not in Britain. It is across the sea, in Brittany, in northwest France, a region that in the Neolithic period shared a common cultural tradition with the British Isles, connected by maritime routes across the Channel and the Bay of Biscay. Carnac, in the Morbihan department of Brittany, is the most concentrated assemblage of megalithic monuments in the world. Not just stone circles, though those are present, but an extraordinary landscape of stone rows that stretches for roughly 4 kilometers and contains more than 3,000 standing stones arranged in roughly 12 parallel alignments. 3,000 stones, 4 kilometers, 12 rows. The scale is almost incomprehensible. The Carnac alignments have been studied for 2 centuries, and there is still no consensus on what they were for. The astronomical interpretation has been proposed many times and in many variants. The rows are oriented roughly east-west, roughly in the direction of the equinox sunrise. But the alignment is not precise enough to serve as a reliable equinox marker, at least not in the form we can see it today. But the Carnac monuments have been heavily disturbed. Stones have been removed for building material. Roads have been cut through the rows. Agricultural activity over millennia has shifted and toppled stones. What we see today is a damaged version of what once existed. What we can say is that the builders of the Carnac monuments were participating in the same tradition as the builders of the British stone circles. The same architectural vocabulary, the same range of monument types, the same broad period of construction, the same general astronomical orientation. The English Channel was not a barrier to this tradition. It was a highway. Maritime communities, as we noted when discussing the navigational function of coastal stone circles, were connected across water as surely as inland communities were connected by roads. The Neolithic cultures of the British Isles and Atlantic France were in regular contact, trading goods and ideas and people across the sea. And the stone circle tradition was part of what they shared, part of what was transmitted across those maritime networks. A common system of astronomical knowledge management, adapted to local conditions but built on shared principles, distributed across the entire Atlantic facade of Western Europe. When we ask why Britain has so many stone circles, we are perhaps asking too narrow a question. The better question might be, why does the Atlantic coast of Europe have so many stone circles? And the answer to that question involves the entire maritime world of the Neolithic Atlantic, the networks of coastal communities from Brittany to the Orkneys who shared a tradition of astronomical observation, monument building, and knowledge management that was one of the great intellectual achievements of the ancient world. Britain has more stone circles than anywhere else because Britain was at the northern end of those networks, in the region where the astronomical phenomena most critical to agricultural success, the extreme positions of the sun and moon, were most obviously legible in the landscape and most dramatically visible. The long dark winters and the dramatic solstice contrasts of the British climate made the solar and lunar cycles more pressing concerns than they were in the Mediterranean world. The marginal agricultural conditions made the accurate prediction of planting and harvesting seasons a matter of life and death rather than mere convenience. Britain needed the circles more urgently than France or Spain or Portugal needed them, and so Britain built more of them. The need created the technology, and the technology created the tradition, and the tradition created the network. And the network was maintained for 1,000 years by people whose intelligence and dedication we are only now beginning to appreciate. This is the real reason Britain has so many stone circles. Not worship, not mystery, not the instinctive spirituality of primitive people, but need. Real, practical, urgent need. The need to know, the need to understand, the need to pass that understanding on to the next generation, and the generation after that, and the generation after that. The need that drives every civilization. The stones are there because the people who built them were like us, intelligent, curious, afraid of what they did not know, determined to know more, reaching toward the sky, asking the same questions we still ask. What time is it? What comes next? Are we ready? The circles answered those questions for 1,000 years, for the communities that built and maintained them. They are still answering, if we know how to ask. And that, finally, is the real story. Not the story of gods and priests and ancient mysteries, the story of people, real people, like us, who looked at the sky and said, we can understand this. And then they did. And they built the proof of it in stone and left it standing for us, waiting for the day we were ready to understand what they had done. That day is arriving, slowly, carefully, one measurement at a time, one alignment at a time. The sky is still there, the stones are still there, and the knowledge is coming back. Look up, listen, the circles are still talking. There is one last thing, one last piece of the puzzle that I have been holding back, saving for this moment, because it is perhaps the most personal part of this entire account, the most human, the most quietly devastating in what it implies about the people we have been talking about all this time. In 2019, archaeologists excavating a site near the village of Wyke Down in Dorset, not far from the great ceremonial complex of Stonehenge and Avebury, uncovered something they were not prepared for. A series of pits, dug with considerable effort into the chalk bedrock, arranged in a pattern that was clearly deliberate. Inside the pits were objects, not the usual assemblage of animal bones and pottery sherds that typically characterizes Neolithic deposits. Something different. Inside the pits were pieces of chalk, carefully shaped pieces of chalk, each one with a series of marks scratched or carved into its surface. The marks were not random, they were systematic. They appeared to record something in a notation system that nobody has yet been able to decode. These were not art objects. They were not ritual offerings in any conventional sense. They were, or appeared to be, records, notes, data. The scratched chalk, equivalent of a spreadsheet or a logbook or a table of observations. What were they recording? We do not know. The notation system has not been deciphered. But the context, a deliberate deposit of record-keeping objects near a complex of astronomical monuments, in a landscape saturated with evidence of sophisticated astronomical observation, suggests something obvious. They were recording observations of the sky. If that interpretation is correct, then what we have at Wyke Down is evidence that the builders of the Neolithic monuments were not only encoding their astronomical knowledge in stone, they were also keeping written records, or the closest thing to written records that their culture had developed. Scratches on chalk, yes, but scratches made in a systematic notation, using a consistent set of symbols, organized in a way that another person familiar with the system could read. This would mean that the knowledge network of Neolithic Britain had not just the stone monuments as its physical expression. It also had some form of portable record-keeping, some way of writing down observations that could be carried from site to site, compared and accumulated into a growing database of astronomical information. If this is right, the picture of the stone circle tradition becomes even more sophisticated than anything we have previously considered, not just monumental astronomy, not just oral tradition, but something approaching a literate tradition, a system of recording that could persist across the death of individual knowledge keepers and the disruption of local communities. The chalk records from Wyke Down have not yet been fully published or analysed. The work of deciphering them, if they can be deciphered at all, is in its very early stages. It may come to nothing. The marks may prove to be purely decorative or ritual in nature, not records of astronomical observations at all. But if they are records, then everything we have been saying about the intelligence and sophistication of the Neolithic builders needs to be revised upward. They were not just extraordinary observers and builders. They were, in some limited sense, writers. They were leaving us not just the monuments, but the notebooks. And we cannot yet read the notebooks, but we will keep trying, because the knowledge is there, waiting. In the stones, in the alignments, in the chalk, in the landscape, in the sky itself, all of it waiting for us to look, to measure, to calculate, to ask the right questions. The circles are still there, and so are we. And the sky, patient and constant, keeps turning, telling us everything if only we would look.